The enemy commander lowered his field glasses, smiled, and gave the order that would erase an entire American platoon from the map. "No survivors," he said to the officers around him. "Not one man walks out of that valley." He believed the storm had already done half his work for him. He believed the Americans were blind, frozen, and finished. What he did not know was that high above him, buried in the ice, half dead and shaking, a wounded American sniper was listening to every word. Her name was Sergeant Avery Collins, and back at the outpost they had already begun to speak of her as a ghost. Before we begin, please take 1 second to subscribe to this channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and leave a comment telling me the city where you are watching from right now so I can see how far this story travels across the world. Now let the story begin. For 4 days, the radio said nothing. Captain Mark Sullivan sat in the command room of the outpost with the handset pressed against his ear, and he listened to the static the way a man listens to a heartbeat that is starting to fade. He had pressed that transmit button so many times that his thumb had gone numb. He knew the frequency by memory. He knew Avery's call sign by memory. He knew the sound of her voice on a good day, calm and dry, always 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. And for 4 days now, that voice had been replaced by a wall of noise that told him nothing except that the world outside had turned against them. "Observation Gamma, this is command," he said again, and his voice did not shake because he would not let it shake in front of the others. "Observation Gamma Collins, do you copy? Give me anything. A click, a breath, anything." Nothing answered him but the storm. Corporal Webb stood in the doorway with his arms folded, watching the captain, the way a young man watches an older one who is refusing to admit something out loud. "Sir," Webb said quietly, "it's been 96 hours. "I know how long it's been, Corporal. "I'm just saying, sir, 96 hours. In that." He tilted his head toward the wall, toward the sound of the wind trying to tear the roof off the building. "Nobody's got gear that lasts that long out there. Nobody." Sullivan set the handset down on the table slowly, and he looked at Webb with the flat patience of a man who had been in command long enough to know that fear travels through a room faster than any bullet. "You want to say she's dead," Sullivan said. "So say it." Webb did not say it. He looked at his boots. "That's what I thought," Sullivan said. "Then keep it in your mouth until I ask for it." The command room went quiet again, and into that quiet came the low, constant groan of the storm, a sound like the whole mountain grinding its teeth. There were 11 men crammed into that small space, and every one of them had heard the exchange, and every one of them was thinking the same thing that Webb had almost said. Sullivan could feel it in the room. He could feel the platoon starting to give her up. And he understood something in that moment that frightened him more than the storm, more than the enemy, more than anything. The day they stopped believing Avery Collins was alive was the day they would start acting like men who were already surrounded. Lieutenant Kim came in from the far corridor, knocking snow off his shoulders, and the look on his face was the look of a man carrying bad news he did not want to be the one to deliver. "Captain, we've got a problem on the eastern line." "Talk to me." "Movement, confirmed movement, 3 separate contacts, maybe more. They're testing the wire, been at it for the last hour." Kim wiped the melt off his face with the back of his glove. "Sir, they're not lost. They're not stragglers. They know exactly where we are, and they're walking right up to the edge of what we can see, and then stepping back to watch what we do about it." "They're measuring us," Sullivan said. "That's how I read it too, sir." Sullivan closed his eyes for 1 second, just one, and in that single second, a whole map opened up behind them. He saw the shape of the thing. The enemy did not probe like this out of curiosity. They probed like this when they were building a picture, when they wanted to know exactly how blind you were before they decided how hard to hit you. And the platoon was blind. That was the terrible truth underneath all of it. Avery had been their eyes. From observation point Gamma, she could see the whole valley, every approach, every ridge, every trail an enemy column might use. As long as she was up there watching, the enemy had to move like men crossing a room where they knew a wolf was awake. Now the wolf had gone silent, and the enemy had noticed. "Corporal Webb," Sullivan said, "what do we actually have for eyes right now?" Webb straightened up. "Our own line of sight from the towers, sir, which in this weather is about 40 meters before the snow eats it. Thermals are worthless in the wind. We've gained nothing past the wire that we can trust." So without Gamma, we're a man standing in a dark field waiting to feel a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, sir," Webb said. "That's about the size of it." Private Brennan had been sitting on an ammunition crate in the corner this whole time, hunched forward, elbows on his knees, and now he stood up so fast that the crate scraped loud across the floor. He was young, he was the youngest man in the platoon, and he had a way of saying exactly the thing that everyone else was too disciplined or too tired to say. "She's not dead," Brennan said. "I'm telling you all right now, she is not dead." Nobody answered him. That was almost worse than if they had. "You think I don't see how you're all looking?" Brennan went on, and his voice cracked a little on the edges. "You've already buried her. In your heads, you've already got the flag folded up. But you don't know her. I do. I ran 3 patrols with that woman. I watched her lie in one spot for 11 hours without moving because moving would have blown the whole mission. 11 hours. She doesn't quit. She doesn't get lost. She doesn't freeze to death in a hole because it got a little cold." His hands were shaking. "She is out there right now, and she is doing exactly what she always does, which is keeping us alive while we sit in here feeling sorry for ourselves." One of the older sergeants, a lean gray man named Doyle, who had said almost nothing in 3 days, finally spoke, and his voice was not cruel. It was gentle, which made it hurt more. "Son," Doyle said, "I hope you're right. I truly do. But I've been doing this a long time, and I've lost good people to weather that wasn't half as bad as this. The cold doesn't care how tough you are. It doesn't care how many patrols you ran. It just takes you, slow and quiet, and it doesn't ask permission." "She's not gone," Brennan said again, but this time it came out softer, almost like a prayer, and he sat back down on the crate and put his face in his hands. Sullivan watched all of it and said nothing because there was nothing he could say that would be both true and kind, and he had learned a long time ago never to offer comfort he could not stand behind. Instead, he turned to the map table and put both fists down on it and leaned his weight into them. He had a decision to make, and every version of that decision cost lives. He could send a rescue team into the mountain. That meant taking good men out of a defensive position that was already too thin and marching them into a storm that had very likely already killed the person they were trying to save. If the enemy hit the outpost while those men were gone, the platoon would break, and the rescue team itself might simply vanish into the white the way Avery had vanished, and then he would have traded a handful of the living for the small, cruel comfort of having tried. Or he could keep everyone here, hold the line, prepare for the assault he could feel coming, and accept that somewhere out in that frozen dark one of his soldiers was dying alone, calling a radio that no longer worked, wondering why nobody came. "Sir," Kim said carefully, "I know that look. Whatever you're deciding, the men need to hear something soon. The waiting is worse than orders, even bad orders." "I know it is. They're starting to come apart at the edges, Captain. Slow, but I can see it." "I can see it too, Lieutenant." Sullivan straightened up. "Give me the eastern line again." Exactly what Webb saw. Kim laid it out. 3 confirmed contacts moving in a pattern that was not the pattern of a patrol trying to stay hidden. They wanted to be half seen. They wanted the men in the towers to catch a shape in the snow and then lose it, catch another, lose that one too, until the defenders started jumping at shadows and burning ammunition on ghosts. It was an old trick, and it was a good one because it worked on the mind before it ever worked on the body. "They're trying to make us tired," Sullivan said. "Tired men make mistakes. Tired men shoot at nothing. Tired men fall asleep on watch." He looked around the room. "So nobody in this outpost shoots at a shadow tonight. You see a confirmed target, you call it, you confirm it with a second set of eyes, and then you engage. We do not waste one single round on a ghost they sent to spook us. Is that understood?" "Understood, sir," came the answer, ragged but real. And for a moment, just a moment, the room felt a little more like a fighting unit and a little less like a group of men waiting to be buried. Then the lights flickered. It was nothing a stutter in the generator as the storm pressed harder against the outside of the building, but in a room already stretched thin, that little flicker landed like a slap. Somebody swore under his breath. Somebody else laughed too high, the kind of laugh that isn't about anything being funny. Brennan lifted his head out of his hands. "Easy," Doyle said to the room. "Easy now. It's just the wind leaning on us." Webb keyed his radio to check on the tower watch, and for a second the reply came back garbled, cut into pieces by the weather, and every man in that room heard the shape of a human voice trapped inside the static, and every man in that room thought the exact same thing at the exact same time. Sullivan saw it happen. He saw 11 faces turn toward the sound at once, and he saw 11 hearts leap for the same impossible reason. That's the tower, Webb said quickly, holding up his hand. That's just the tower, that's Ramirez. It's not Gamma, it's the tower. The hope drained out of the room so fast it left a kind of ache behind. Brennan turned away toward the wall. Doyle let out a slow breath through his nose, and Sullivan understood standing there that this was the real enemy tonight. Not the men at the wire, the hope. The way it kept rising up out of nothing and then dying over and over, and each time it died, it took a little more out of them than the time before. He could not lead men who were being killed one heartbeat at a time by their own hope. "Listen to me," Sullivan said, and he said it loud enough that even the men in the corridor could hear. "Every one of you needs to hear me say this so that we all stop torturing ourselves with maybes. I don't know if Sergeant Collins is alive. I want her to be. God knows I do. But wanting it isn't a plan, and hope isn't a weapon, and I will not let this platoon fall apart because we keep flinching every time the radio crackles." He let that land. "Here is what we know for certain. The enemy is out there. The enemy is testing us. The enemy thinks we are blind and broken and easy. And in about the only good news I've got tonight, they are wrong about the broken part. So we are going to hold this ground. We are going to hold it whether Collins is alive or not, whether help is coming or not, because that is the job, and the job does not stop just because we're scared." The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, a steadier one. "Now get to your posts," Sullivan said. "Warm rotations 30 minutes on 15 off nobody freezes at their gun. Kim, you have the eastern line. Webb, the towers are yours. Doyle, you're on the men. Keep them talking, keep them awake, keep them together." "Brennan." The young private turned. "You keep believing she's alive," Sullivan said quieter now just to him. "You hear me? You keep believing it, because if she is out there, then somebody in this outpost owes to be holding the line for her too, and I'm making that your job. Don't you let go of it." Brennan's jaw tightened, and he nodded, and something in him seemed to gather itself back up off the floor. "Yes, sir." They filed out to their posts, and one by one the room emptied until it was just Sullivan and the map and the dead radio. He sat back down. He picked up the handset. He knew it was foolish. He knew every man who had just walked out of that room would have told him it was foolish. But he pressed the button anyway because some part of leading people is doing the foolish, faithful thing when nobody is watching. "Avery," he said, not the call sign this time, just her name. "It's Mark. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't even know if this thing is throwing my voice out into that storm or just eating it. But if you're out there, I need you to hold on. We haven't given up on you. Whatever it looks like in here, whatever the odds are, I am telling you that we have not given up on you. So don't you dare give up on us." Static answered him. Just static. He set the handset down and he rubbed his eyes, and he told himself it was the cold making them water. What Sullivan could not know, what none of them could know, was that at that very moment on the far side of the valley and thousands of feet up into the teeth of the storm, Avery Collins was still breathing. Barely, but still. The storm had taken almost everything from her. It had taken her observation post first when the wind ripped the shelter apart around her on the second night and scattered her equipment into the dark. It had taken her radio, which now lay somewhere under a foot of new snow, as dead and useless as a stone. It had taken the feeling from her left hand and most of the feeling from her feet, and it was working patiently on the rest of her. She had been forced to abandon her position entirely, to climb because staying meant dying and moving meant maybe not dying yet. And when those are your only two choices, you learn very quickly which one your body will choose for you. She had found a crack in the rock. That was all it was. A narrow split in the mountain's face, barely wide enough to wedge her body into, but it broke the wind, and in a place like that, breaking the wind was the difference between life and death. She had crawled into it, and she had pulled what was left of her gear around her, and she had begun the oldest fight there is, the one every soldier who has ever been cold and alone and hurt has fought, which is the fight to stay awake, to stay angry, to stay alive out of pure stubbornness, when every soft voice inside you is telling you to just close your eyes for a minute. "Not yet," she said out loud to nobody, because the sound of her own voice was one of the few things she had left that proved she was still real. Not yet, not like this. She thought about the outposts. She thought about all of them, and the thought was not sentimental because she did not have the strength for the sentiment, but it was fierce. They were down there in the valley with no eyes. That was the thing that kept circling back around in her freezing mind. They had no eyes. Her whole purpose, the entire reason she had been sent up onto this miserable rock, was to be their eyes, and she had gone dark. And now they were sitting down there blind while something moved against them in the dark. She had seen it start. Before the storm took her radio, before it took her post, she had watched the enemy begin to shift. Small movements at first, a column here, a cache being stocked there. The kind of quiet, methodical buildup that a trained eye recognizes not as random activity, but as preparation. She had tried to call it in. She had screamed it into her radio for hours before the radio died, and she had no way of knowing whether a single word of it had gotten through. Probably not, she thought. Probably it all died in the same static Sullivan was cursing right now, which meant that whatever she had seen, she was the only one who had seen it. She was the only person alive who understood what was actually coming for that outpost. And she was stuck in a crack, in a rock, half frozen with a rifle. She was no longer sure she could even feel her hands well enough to fire. Stop, she told herself. Stop counting what you don't have. Count what you've got. It was a discipline, an old one drilled into her across years of training and worse. When everything is going wrong, when panic is a warm and inviting thing standing right at the edge of your mind, you do not look at the mountain. You look at the next handhold. You do not solve the war. You solve the next breath. And so she began deliberately coldly to take an inventory of what she still had, the way you might count coins in your pocket when you are not sure you have enough to get home. She had her rifle. She checked it, working her ruined fingers slowly, and by some mercy the mechanism was still clean, still functional. That was 1 coin. She had ammunition. Not much, but some. 2 coins. She had her mind, which was slowing down in the cold, but had not yet stopped, and which was, when you got right down to it, the most dangerous weapon she carried and always had been. 3 coins. And she had her position. She was high, higher than she had ever intended to be, higher than any sane person would set up to observe from, because from this height the distances became absurd, the shots became impossible, the physics turned into a cruel joke. But she was high, and high meant she could see. And as the wind shifted just for a moment and tore a hole in the wall of snow below her, she saw. She saw the valley floor. She saw the enemy. And what she saw stopped her heart in her chest more surely than any cold could have. They were not probing anymore. Down there, spread across the low ground where the storm was thinnest, the enemy had gathered in numbers she had not imagined. This was not a patrol. This was not a raid. This was an army in miniature, assembling itself with the calm, terrible confidence of men who believe they have already won. She could see the shape of it now, the whole architecture of the thing, and her trained mind read it the way another person might read a sentence. Mortar teams positioning, heavy weapons being brought forward, and at the center of it, moving between the elements, directing, adjusting a knot of officers around a single figure who could only be the commander. The man whose orders held the entire assault together like a keystone holds an arch. She understood in one long, sickening moment exactly what was about to happen. The enemy was going to hit the outpost with everything at once in a single coordinated blow designed to be over before the defenders even understood it had begun. They would drop mortars onto the towers to blind and stun. They would pour heavy fire onto the walls to pin every man down. And then the infantry waiting in the dark would simply walk in through the smoke and finish what the artillery started. 40 men, 30 minutes, maybe less. And the outpost had no idea. They were down there right now, warming their hands 30 on and 15 off, watching for shadows on the wire, and they had no idea that the killing blow was already loaded and aimed. No, Avery breathed. No, no, no. She did the only thing she could do. She started to reach for a radio that was not there, her hand closing on empty snow, and the reality of it hit her all over again. No radio, no signal, no way at all to warn them. She could see the whole thing coming, and she could not scream loud enough to be heard. She was a woman standing on a cliff, watching a train speed toward a broken bridge, and there was nobody to flag down, nothing to throw onto the tracks, no way to close the distance between what she knew and what they needed to know. Except one, the thought came to her slowly, and then all at once, and when it fully arrived, it was so enormous and so impossible that she almost laughed, a dry, cracked sound with no joy in it. She could not warn them, but she could reach them. She had a rifle. She had ammunition. She had height and she had a clear line of sight down onto the very heart of the thing, onto the officers, onto the commander, onto the one man whose death would turn a coordinated assault into a leaderless mob. If she could not tell the outpost that the storm was coming, then maybe she could break the storm before it ever arrived. Then she measured the distance, and the small, terrible laugh died in her throat. It was not a shot. It was a fantasy. The commander stood so far below her across so much churning air that the numbers her mind began to assemble read less like a firing solution and more like a suicide note. The range was beyond anything she had ever attempted, beyond anything most snipers would even discuss as a serious possibility. Between her rifle and that man lay thousands of meters of screaming Arctic crossflow, wind that changed direction and speed at every altitude the bullet would fall through. The temperature was so far below zero that the very air itself was thick and strange, and would drag at the round in ways she would have to calculate by feel, by memory, by instinct, because every instrument she had ever relied on to make such a calculation was buried in the snow or ripped away by the storm. The bullet would be in the air for a long time, long enough that the commander could take 3 full steps in any direction before it ever arrived, long enough that the earth itself would turn beneath its flight, long enough that 100 tiny errors, any one of which would be invisible and unforgivable, would have time to grow into a miss of dozens of feet. She would have 1 round to spare for a ranging shot if she was lucky, and a ranging shot at this distance in this wind might land so far off that it told her almost nothing except to warn the enemy that death was watching them from above. It was by every measure she had ever been taught an impossible shot, a shot no soldier should ever make, a shot no soldier should even survive attempting, because the recoil alone against her frozen and injured body might do damage she could not afford. Impossible, she said to the storm, and the storm roaring seemed to agree with her. But then another thought moved through the cold and the fear quiet and simple, and it was the thought that had made her what she was, the thought that separated her from every soldier who had ever looked at a hard problem and decided it could not be done. If she did nothing, they all died. That was certain. That was the one number in the whole equation that carried no doubt at all. Do nothing, and 40 men she had trained with and marched with and bled with would be dead before the next sunrise, and she would lie here in this crack in the rock and freeze to death, having watched it happen, having done nothing, having decided that the shot was too hard. If she took the shot, they probably still died because the shot was almost certainly going to miss. But probably was not certainly. Probably left a door open, just a crack, just wide enough for a miracle to squeeze through. And Avery Collins had spent her whole career walking through doors that other people swore were shut. She wiped the frost from her eyes with the back of her ruined glove. She began very slowly to move her body into position, ignoring the way the cold screamed in her joints, ignoring the fact that she could no longer feel most of her left hand, ignoring the voice that kept telling her to close her eyes and rest. She settled the rifle. She found the commander again through her scope, a small dark figure moving among smaller dark figures, utterly unaware that thousands of meters and thousands of feet away, a dying woman had just decided to spend the last of her strength trying to kill him. "All right," she whispered. Her breath fogged and froze. "All right, let's do the impossible." And down in the valley, warm inside the false confidence of a man who has already counted his victory, the enemy commander lifted his field glasses toward the outpost one final time, and he began to give the order that would send his mortars into the sky. He did not feel her watching him. He did not know she was there at all. He believed with his whole heart that the only thing waiting in those mountains was the storm. And back at the outpost, Captain Mark Sullivan sat alone with a dead radio in his hand, still refusing against all reason and all evidence to fold the flag in his mind, still whispering into the static, still holding the line for a ghost. Neither of them knew that the next 6 seconds were about to decide everything. She settled into the rock, and the first thing she had to fight was her own body. Her hands would not do what she told them. Avery Collins looked down at her own fingers wrapped around the rifle, and it was like looking at somebody else's hands, somebody who had died a little while ago and forgotten to let go. The left one was the worst. She could see it gripping the forestock, but she could not feel the grip, and a sniper who cannot feel her own hands is a sniper who cannot feel the tiny invisible pressures that make the difference between a hit and a miss at any range, let alone at a range like this one. "Come on," she whispered to the hand. "Come on, work. Just a little longer. Then you can quit." She flexed the fingers. Pain came up through the numbness, like light through deep water, distant and slow. But it came, and pain was good. Pain meant the hand was still alive. She worked it open, and closed, and each time it moved a little more, and she talked to it the whole time like it was a frightened animal she was trying to coax out of a corner. Below her, thousands of feet down, the enemy commander lowered his field glasses. She saw it happen through her scope. She saw the small, dark figure at the center of all that careful, murderous activity drop the glasses to his chest and turn to the men around him, and she did not need to hear his voice to know what he was doing. He was giving the order. The waiting was over. Somewhere down there, a mortar crew was already adjusting the angle of a tube toward the outpost. And once those tubes started coughing, there would be nothing anybody could do. "No," Avery breathed. "Not yet. Give me one more minute. Just one." The commander did not give her one more minute. Why would he? He did not know she existed. And that was the thing that nearly broke her, kneeling there in the crack in the rock with her dead hand and her half a magazine. He did not know she existed. To that man and to every man down in that valley, Sergeant Avery Collins was already a corpse. She was a name that had gone quiet on a radio 4 days ago. She was a loss the enemy had already counted and moved past. The most powerful thing she had left, she realized the only real weapon she truly possessed, was that nobody down there believed she was still in the fight. She could use that. She had to use that. 900 meters below and half a valley away, the outpost had no idea that the clock had just started running. Inside the command room, Captain Mark Sullivan felt the change before anyone reported it. He had spent his whole career learning to read the mood of a battlefield, the way a farmer reads a sky, and something in the last few minutes had shifted. The probing on the eastern line had stopped. Not tapered off. Stopped. All at once. And in his experience, a thing that stops all at once has not gone away. It has finished getting ready. "Kim," he said into the radio, "the eastern line, talk to me." Lieutenant Kim's voice came back tight. "That's what I was about to call you about, sir. They pulled back. All of them. 10 minutes ago, I had 3-4 contacts on the wire. Now I've got nothing. Clean. It's like somebody rang a bell and called them all home." "They're not home," Sullivan said. "They're staging." "That was my red too, sir." Sullivan stood up so fast his chair went over behind him. Everybody up, right now. Full alert, all posts, no rotations. I want every gun manned and every eye open. This is it. Whatever they've been building to, they're about to spend it." "Sir, on what?" Webb's voice cut in from the towers. "On what indicator? I've got nothing else here. It's a wall of white. I can't see 40 meters. "On the fact that they stopped," Sullivan said. "On the fact that an enemy who's been poking us for 3 days just went completely silent. You don't go silent to leave, Corporal. You go silent to swing." He was already pulling his gear on. "Doyle, get the men into hard cover. Now, not in a minute, now." And that was the moment, precisely that moment, when Avery Collins settled her cheek against the frozen stock of her rifle and began to do the impossible math. She had done range calculations 10,000 times in her life. She could do them in her sleep and had waking up with numbers already running behind her eyes. But she had never done them like this, with no rangefinder, no ballistic computer, no wind meter, no data book that hadn't been scattered across a mountainside by the storm. She had nothing but what was inside her own skull, and her skull was cold, and cold makes a mind slow and stupid and confident all at once, which is the most dangerous thing a mind can be. So she did not trust her confidence. She distrusted every number the moment it arrived, and she checked it against a second number and a third, and only when they agreed did she let herself believe it. The range first, she could not measure it, so she built it piece by piece from things she knew. She knew the height of a man. She held that man in her scope, and she measured him against the reticle. The tiny hash marks she had memorized so long ago. They were more familiar than the lines on her own palm, and from the space he took up, she read the distance the way you might read the depth of a well, by how long it takes a stone to hit the bottom. The number that came back was a number that made her stomach turn. It was farther than she had ever fired in her life. It was farther than almost anyone had ever fired at a living target and hit. At that distance, the bullet would not travel in anything a normal person would call a straight line. It would climb and arc and fall, dropping something like the height of a 9-story building over the course of its flight, and she would have to aim not at the man, but at a patch of empty sky far above, and to the side of him, trusting the fall in the wind to bring the round down into the place where he would be standing 6 full seconds from now. 6 seconds. That was the other horror of it. From the moment she pulled the trigger to the moment the bullet arrived, 6 seconds would pass. In 6 seconds, a man can take 4 or 5 steps. In 6 seconds, a man can turn crouch. Neil walked out of the shot entirely without ever knowing a shot was coming. She was not going to shoot the commander where he was. She was going to have to shoot him where he was going to be, and she was going to have to guess where that was, from thousands of meters away in a storm with a dying body. "Okay," she said to herself very quietly, her breath crystallizing on the rifle. "Okay, so you can't shoot the man. Fine. You've never been able to shoot the man. You shoot the future. That's all this ever is. You look at where he's going, and you put the bullet there, and you wait for the world to catch up." She watched him. She made herself go still, stiller than the coal was, making her a deliberate, held stillness, and she studied the way the commander moved. Everything about a person tells you something if you watch long enough. She watched where his weight settled. She watched the way he kept drifting back to one particular spot, a spot near what she guessed was a command element, some cluster of equipment or officers that kept pulling him back like a tether. Men have habits. Men under stress have stronger habits, not weaker ones, because the mind under pressure reaches for the familiar. He kept returning to that spot. He would give an order walk a few paces to point at something and then come back to that same patch of ground to watch the effect of what he'd commanded. That patch of ground, that was where she would put the bullet, not on him, on the place his habits kept dragging him back to. Down in the valley, the first mortar tube found its angle. Avery could not see it directly, but she saw the men around it stop moving with the particular finality of a crew that has finished laying its weapon and is now only waiting for the word. She had maybe seconds, not minutes, seconds. Her heart, which had been slow and thick with cold, began to pound, and she cursed it, because a pounding heart moves the rifle. A pounding heart throws off everything. A pounding heart at the moment of the shot is the enemy of everything a sniper is. She had trained her whole life to shoot between heartbeats, to find that small, still pond of silence in the gap between one beat and the next, and to send the round across it. But her heart was hammering now, frightened, dying, and the still pond was gone. "Slow down," she told it. She closed her eyes just for a second. "Slow down. You've done this. You've done this 1,000 times. This is just one more. This is just the next one. Slow down." And here's the strange thing, the thing that only people who have stood at the edge of something impossible will understand. Her heart obeyed her, not because she willed it calm, but because she stopped fighting the fear and simply set it down beside her like a pack she was taking off her shoulders. And she said to it, "You can come with me, but you cannot drive." And the fear for one long moment agreed. The pounding eased. Her body, which had been shaking, went quiet. The cold was still there. The pain was still there. The dying was still there, but they all took one step back and gave her room. This was the thing Brennan had been trying to make the others understand back in the outpost when he swore she was still alive. She doesn't quit. It wasn't toughness exactly. It was that she knew how to make a home inside a moment that should have been unbearable and to stay there calm for as long as the job required. Now she had to solve the wind, and the wind was the thing that was going to kill this shot if anything did. She could not measure it. She had no instrument. So she read it the way sailors read water off the things it touched. She watched the snow blow across the valley at a dozen different heights, and she saw that it was not one wind, but many a stacked deck of separate winds, each layer moving at its own speed in its own angle. Down low near the commander, the snow drifted almost lazily, sheltered by the terrain. Higher up, halfway between them, it screamed sideways in long white ropes. And up here where she was, it came in hard gusts that shoved at the barrel of her rifle and tried to push the whole shot off the mountain. The bullet was going to fly through every one of those layers. It would leave her barrel fighting the high gusts, then cross into the screaming middle band where it would be shoved hard sideways for most of its flight, and then it would drop down into the calm, low air right at the end, right where precision mattered most. Each layer would push it a different way by a different amount, and all of those pushes would add up into one single total drift. And if she got that total wrong by even a little, the bullet would sail past the commander by dozens of feet and bury itself harmlessly in the snow, and the mortars would fire and the outpost would die. She did the math. She did it the only way she could, by breaking the flight into pieces and solving each piece and adding them together. holding the running total in her frozen mind, like a woman carrying water in her cupped hands, terrified of spilling a single drop. The wind wanted to push the bullet left. A lot. She would have to aim far to the right of the commander to let it drift back onto him. But there was the drop, too, the enormous fall that meant aiming high, and there was the cold, thick air that would drag at the round and steal its speed, which meant aiming even higher. And there was one more thing, a thing so small that most shooters never had to think about it. But at this distance and this flight time, it mattered. The earth itself was turning beneath the bullet. Over 6 seconds of flight, the ground below moved just slightly, and she would have to account for even that. A correction so subtle it was almost mystical, the kind of thing you only ever needed when you were reaching out to touch something so far away that the curve of the world itself got a vote. She stacked all of it together. Right for the win, up for the drop, up again for the thin, cold drag, a hair's adjustment for the turning earth. And on top of all of it, the led the guess about the future, the patch of ground his habits kept pulling him back toward. When she was done, she had a single aiming point, a spot in the empty air high and to the right of a man who had no idea he was being measured for a coffin. It looked wrong. It looked insane. If anyone had been kneeling beside her and looked through the scope, they would have seen her aiming at nothing at a piece of blank white sky with no target anywhere near it, and they would have thought the cold had taken her mind. "Trust it," she whispered. "You did the work. Trust the work. Don't flinch at the end. Don't chase him. Trust the number and send it, and let the world do the rest." Far below, a runner reached the commander with some final report, and the commander nodded and lifted his hand. Avery knew that hand. She had seen 100 commanders make that gesture across a career full of watching men give orders through a scope. That raised hand was the last thing that happens before the world comes apart. When it dropped, the mortars would fire. She had run out of time to be afraid. She took her breath, the one good breath, and let half of it out and held the rest, and in the small, quiet pond that opened up between two beats of her slowed heart, she laid the crosshair on that patch of empty sky, and she did not aim at the man. She aimed at the place the man was going, and she pressed the trigger with a finger she could not feel gently. Gently, the way you press it when you have loved a rifle your whole life. And you know that jerking it, even a hair will throw the whole world off, and the rifle fired. The recoil slammed into her frozen shoulder, and white paint exploded down her arm, and she nearly blacked out from it, but she held on. She held the position because a sniper who moves after the shot loses the ability to see where it went, and she needed to see. And then there was nothing to do but wait. 6 seconds. It does not sound like a long time. Say it out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It is nothing. It is the time it takes to tie a shoe. But those 6 seconds with the bullet already gone and beyond recall, arcing up into the storm and beginning its long fall across the whole width of the valley, were the longest 6 seconds of Avery Collins's life, and she lived every single one of them, stretched out into an eternity. 1. The bullet climbed into the high gusts, and she could not see it. No one could ever see it, but she could feel it in her mind, feel it being shoved by the same wind that was shoving her. And she thought, did I read that gust right? Did I give it enough? And it was too late to change anything. 2. It crossed into the screaming middle band and began to drift, sliding sideways through the air. And in her mind, she watched it drift and prayed it was drifting exactly as much as she had told it to, not a foot more, not a foot less. 3. The commander's raised hand was still up. He was saying something. He was drawing it out the way men do when they are savoring a moment when they believe they are about to win. His arrogance was buying her time she had not earned and did not deserve, and she hated him, and in that half second, she was almost grateful to him. 4. The bullet was falling, now dropping down out of the screaming band toward the calm, low air, dropping the height of a building, and she thought about all the ways this could still go wrong. The round could tumble, could have been nicked by a gust she never saw, could be sailing 3 feet wide right now, with nothing left to correct it. 5. The commander lowered his hand. He lowered it to give the order. He lowered it to send the mortars into the sky. And as he lowered it, he took one single step back toward that patch of ground his habits had been pulling him toward and all along, back to the exact spot where a dying woman thousands of meters away had decided to place the future. 6. The bullet arrived. There was no sound for her, not at that distance, not over the storm. There was only what she saw through the scope. The small dark figure that had been the center of the whole enemy machine, the keystone of the arch, the one man whose orders held the coordinated assault together simply dropped. One instant, standing hands still coming down. The next instant, a shape crumpling into the snow, boneless final in a way that no living man ever moves. The commander was dead before the sound of the shot could ever have reached him, if it reached him at all. And for one heartbeat, one single heartbeat, the entire valley did not understand what had happened. Avery watched it dawn on them. She watched it ripple outward through her scope, the confusion spreading from that central spot like rings in a pond. The men closest to the commander turned toward him and then toward each other, and their body language changed in an instant from the confident, coordinated purpose of an army about to strike into something else endearable, something loose and jerky and afraid. They looked up. They looked around. They looked at the mountains, at the storm, at nothing because there was nothing to see because death had come from a place so far away that it could not possibly have come from there. And men will always look for the danger they can understand before they will accept the one they cannot. They could not find her. They would never find her. She was a piece of the storm. "That's for the platoon," she whispered, and her voice broke and she did not care. "That's for every one of them. You didn't even know I was here." Down in the valley, the mortars did not fire. The crews were ready. The tubes were laid. The angle was set. But the hand that was supposed to drop and send that first round into the sky was lying dead in the snow, and no other hand rose to take its place. Because in an army built around one man's will, the sudden removal of that man does not simply cost you a leader. It costs you the very thing that was holding all the separate pieces in one shape. The mortar crews looked to the officers. The officers looked to where the commander had been standing, and the commander was a corpse, and no one had been told what to do if the corpse could no longer speak. The assault stalled, not stopped, stalled. A great machine that had been about to strike now stood frozen with its arm raised, waiting for a command that would never come. And at the outpost that stall was the difference between annihilation and survival, though no one inside those walls yet understood why. Captain Sullivan crouched behind hardcover with his rifle up, and his whole body coiled for the blow he knew was coming. The blow every instinct told him was seconds away, and the blow did not come. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. The eastern line had gone silent to swing, and the swing had not landed. Something had happened out there in the white, something he could not see and did not understand. And the assault that should have already been tearing his outpost apart had simply not begun. "Kim," he said quietly into the radio. "Anything." "Negative, sir," Kim answered, and his voice was full of the same baffled tension Sullivan felt. "They were ready. I'd stake my life on it. They were seconds from hitting us. And then nothing. They stopped, sir. I don't understand it." "Neither do I," Sullivan said. Sir Webb's voice came from the towers, and it was strange, careful like a man who has seen something he cannot quite believe. "Sir, I think I saw something. Off the ridgeline, way off, way past our sector. Just for a second, the snow opened up, and I thought I don't know what I saw." "What did it look like, Corporal?" "Like the whole valley flinched, sir," Webb said. "Like somebody down there just took a punch nobody threw." Sullivan went very still behind his cover. He was a practical man. He did not believe in miracles, and he did not believe in luck, and he had spent 4 days refusing to fold a flag in his mind precisely because he did not let himself believe in things that could not be measured. But he had also been a soldier long enough to know that an enemy does not assemble a coordinated assault, bring it to the very edge of launching, and then abandon it in the span of 30 seconds for no reason at all. Something had reached into that valley and broken the machine. Something had killed the thing that was holding it together. And there was only one asset, one single asset, that had ever been able to reach into that valley from a place the enemy could not find. "Brennan," Sullivan said into the radio, and his voice was not quite steady. "Where are you?" "North Post, sir," the young private answered. "Standing to, waiting for it like everybody else." "You said she was alive." There was a pause. "Sir, you stood in my command room and you told all of us she was alive, that she was out there doing exactly what she always does, keeping us alive, while we sat around feeling sorry for ourselves." Sullivan's throat was tight. "You said that?" "Yes, sir," Brennan said very quietly. "I did." Sullivan looked out into the whiteout, toward the mountains, out toward the impossible high ground, where no living person should have been able to survive 4 days in that storm, and he felt something move in his chest that he had not let himself feel since the radio first went dark. "Corporal Webb," he said, "that flinch you saw in the valley, that was a shot." "Sir, that's not possible. There's no position out there that could reach the valley floor, not from anywhere we hold, and certainly not in this. The range alone it'd be thousands of meters. No one can make that shot, sir. No one." "Somebody just did," Sullivan said. The word moved through the outpost the way a spark moves through dry grass. Nobody said it out loud at first, because to say it out loud was to risk that terrible rising and dying of hope all over again. That thing that had been killing them one heartbeat at a time for 4 days. But it moved anyway from post to post, in half sentences, in shared looks, in the way men who had been braced for death slowly began to raise their heads. The enemy had stalled. Something had reached into the valley from the mountains, and there was only one person it could be. At the north post, Private Brennan pressed his back against the frozen wall and shut his eyes and felt the tears come, and he did not fight them, and he was not ashamed of them. "I told you," he said to no one, to everyone, to the storm. "I told you she was still out there. I told you." But Avery Collins, 3,000 meters and half a lifetime away, could not hear him. She had made the shot, and the making of it had taken the last of what she had. The moment the recoil had slammed through her frozen shoulder, something in her had let go some final reserve she had been running on for 4 days, and now that the target was down and the mortars had gone silent, her body was collecting the bill for everything she had spent. The scope swam in front of her eye. The valley blurred. The strength that had held her rigid and still and precise through the shot drained out of her all at once, and she slumped sideways against the rock, the rifle still clutched in her ruined hands, because letting go of the rifle was a thing she did not know how to do. "Okay," she whispered. Her voice was barely there. "Okay, it's done, I did it." But it was not done, and some cold, clear part of her mind that would not stop working even now knew it was not done, and that part of her forced her eyes back open before they could fall shut for the last time. Because the enemy had stalled. They had not left. A stalled enemy is a wounded animal, and a wounded animal does one of two things. It runs or it lashes out, and she had no way of knowing which this one would do. If they ran, the outpost was saved, and she could finally close her eyes. But if their fear curdled into rage of some surviving officer down there, gathered the shaken pieces back together, and pointed them at the mountains to find whoever had killed their commander, then the fight was not over at all. It was just beginning, and she was at the center of it, alone, freezing out of strength with half a magazine and a body that would no longer answer her. She dragged herself upright against the rock. Every inch of it was agony. She got her eye back to the scope, forced the swimming valley to steady, and made herself do the job, even now, because the job was the only thing left holding her together. What she saw made her breath catch. Down in the valley, in the churning confusion where the command element had been, a knot of figures had gathered around the fallen commander, and they were not looking down at him anymore. They had stopped looking at their dead leader. They had started looking up, at the mountains, at the ridgelines, at the high ground where the impossible shot must have come from. They were pointing right at her. They had not found her, not exactly. They could not possibly have pinpointed a single woman wedged into a crack in the rock at that range. But they had done the math the same way Sullivan had done it from the other direction. A shot had come from the high ground. The high ground was that ridge. And now a dozen men and then 24 were beginning to move, breaking away from the stalled assault, turning their backs on the outpost entirely, and starting up into the storm. Up the long white slope, up toward the only place the shot could have come from. They were coming for her. Avery Collins lowered her eye from the scope and looked for one moment at her own frozen, useless hands, and then out at the white nothing of the storm. And she understood with perfect clarity that she had just traded the outpost's death for her own. She had saved 40 men by making herself the most hunted person on that mountain. And she was in no condition to run, and she was in no condition to fight, and there was nowhere left to climb. She reached down slowly, and she felt for her magazine, and she counted by touch the rounds she had left. Then she settled back against the rock, and she turned her scope down the slope toward the first of the dark shapes climbing up through the snow toward her, and she waited, because waiting was the one thing she had always been better at than anyone alive. She counted 6 rounds by touch, and 6 rounds against 24 men climbing toward her was not a fight. It was an arithmetic problem with only one answer. Avery Collins knew that answer. She had known it the moment she pulled the trigger. If she was honest with herself, known that killing the commander meant painting a target on her own back that no amount of snow could hide. But she looked at the 6 rounds, and she did not feel despair, because despair was a luxury, and she had run out of luxuries 4 days ago. She felt something colder and clearer than despair. She felt the old calm settle over her again, the working calm, the one that did not care about odds, because odds were just another number, and numbers were things you managed, not things you feared. "All right," she whispered to the 6 rounds, "so we make every one of you count, every single one." The first dark shape came up out of the storm about 400 meters below her, and then a second beside it, and then more behind those, and they were climbing hard fast the way men climb when they are angry and frightened and want the anger to swallow the fear. They were not being careful. That was her first small mercy. A careful man climbing toward a hidden sniper moves from cover to cover, low patient, giving you nothing. These men were charging up an open slope because their leader was dead in the snow and somebody had to pay for it, and they wanted to be the ones who made him pay. Their grief was making them stupid, and stupid men, even 24 of them, could be managed by a smart one with 6 rounds and high ground. But 6 rounds, that was the wall she kept running into. 6. She thought about the outpost. She thought about Sullivan, whose voice she had not heard in 4 days, but whom she could picture perfectly, that flat, steady patience of his, the way he never let a room see him afraid. She thought about Brennan, who was probably down there right now swearing to anybody who'd listen that she was still alive. She thought about all of them warm now, or warmer safe now, or safer because the mortars had never fired. And she thought that has to be enough. Whatever happens up here, that has to be enough. You don't get to save them and survive it too. Nobody gets both. And then the harder thought came, the one underneath, but I'd like to try. That surprised her. She had made her peace with dying somewhere around the second day when the storm took her shelter, and she started to climb. She had set her own life down the way she'd set down the fear said, "You can come with me, but you cannot drive." And yet here at the very end, watching those dark shapes climb toward her through the white, she found that some stubborn animal part of her had not signed off on the arrangement at all. It wanted to live. It wanted absurdly, ridiculously, to walk off this mountain on her own 2 ruined feet and stand in that command room and see the look on Sullivan's face. "Greedy," she told herself and almost smiled. "You already got your miracle. Now you want 2. 400 meters became 350. The lead climber was moving well, angling across the slope, and behind him, the others were spreading out into a loose line, and even in their grief and their haste, some instinct was pulling them into the shape of men who meant to surround the thing they were hunting. They would try to flank her, come at the crack in the rock from more than one side, so that wherever she pointed her rifle, someone was climbing into her blind spot. She could not let them spread. 6 rounds meant she had to keep them bunched, keep them scared, keep them thinking the mountain itself was killing them one at a time. A sniper's real weapon at these odds was never the bullet. It was the dread the bullet left behind. She settled the crosshair on the lead climber. He was close now, close enough that the shot was almost trivial compared to the one she'd already made 300 meters instead of thousands a shot. She could make in her sleep a shot she had made in her sleep. But she waited. She did not take him yet. She wanted him higher. She wanted the others to be watching him, following him, trusting that if he made it, they'd make it so that when he dropped, he'd take their courage with him. 300 meters, 250. "Come on," she breathed. "Come on, a little more. Bring your friends." Down at the outpost, 1,200 meters, and a whole world away, Captain Sullivan was piecing the same picture together from the opposite side, and what he was piecing together turned his blood cold. "Kim, say that again," he said into the radio. "They're pulling off our line, sir," Kim repeated, and there was something in his voice halfway between wonder and horror. The whole Eastern element. They're not assaulting us, and they're not withdrawing to their staging areas. They're moving up, into the high ground, toward the ridge. "Toward the ridge," Sullivan said slowly. "Yes, sir, away from us entirely. Whatever's up there, they want it more than they want us now." Sullivan stood in the middle of the command room with the map in front of him, and he looked at the ridge, that high impossible ground, and he did the thing he'd been refusing to do for 4 days, which was to let himself fully, completely believe it. Somebody was up there. Somebody had been up there this whole time. Somebody had watched the enemy assemble, had understood what was coming, had found a way to reach down into that valley and kill the one man holding the assault together, and in doing so had saved every soul in this outpost. And now that somebody had done the arithmetic that Sullivan was doing right now, the same brutal arithmetic, and the answer was that a whole enemy element had turned its back on 40 defended men to go hunting one exposed soul on a mountainside. They were going to kill whoever had saved them, and Sullivan was going to sit here in his warm command room and let it happen because the sane thing, the by-the-book thing, the thing that kept the most people alive was to hold your defended position and not throw men into a storm chasing a hunch. "Doyle," Sullivan said, "get in here, umpire." The gray old sergeant came in shaking snow off his shoulders. "Sir, I need a number from you and I need it straight. If I pull a team, 6 men 7, and send them up that ridge right now into that, what are the odds they come back?" Doyle didn't answer right away. He was not a man who threw numbers around to make people feel better. "In this weather syrup terrain, we've never mapped toward an enemy element we can't count that's already moving low. I won't dress it up for you. It's low. And if I don't send them, then whoever's up there dies alone," Doyle said quietly. "If they're not dead already." Sullivan closed his eyes. 200 meters up on the mountain, and Avery Collins took her first shot. She dropped the lead climber clean one round center mass, and he went down and did not get up, and she was already off him and hunting the next before his body had finished falling. The whole line below her froze for one precious second, that universal instant of shock, when men who have been climbing toward a thing they can't see suddenly learn exactly how real it is. And in that frozen second, she took her second man, another clean drop. And now there were 4 rounds left and 2 enemy dead, and a slope full of men who had just remembered they were mortal. They went to ground, all of them at once throwing themselves flat into the snow, and just like that, her advantage began to shrink, because a man on his belly in the snow in a whiteout is very nearly invisible, and a man she cannot see is a man she cannot shoot, and a man she cannot shoot is a man who is crawling closer. 4, she said to herself. 4 left. Make them wonder how many I've got. That was the game now. Not killing them. She couldn't kill 20 men with 4 rounds. The game was fear. As long as they believed the mountain held a shooter with unlimited ammunition and perfect aim, they would crawl and hesitate and second-guess every inch of ground. The moment they realized she was nearly dry, they would stand up and rush her, and it would be over in a handful of seconds. So every shot from here on had to do double work. It had to hit, and it had to lie. It had to say there's plenty more where that came from. "Don't you dare stand up." She waited. A shape shifted in the snow. A man losing his nerve for the flat crawl coming up onto his knees to move faster, and she took him 3rd round, and he pitched back down and did not move, and the whole slope pressed itself flatter into the earth. 3 rounds. She was buying time with her own life, and she knew exactly how much of it she had left to spend. And then the storm did something. It thinned. Just for a few seconds, the way it had thinned before when it showed her the valley. The wind dropped and the curtain of snow pulled back, and suddenly she could see the whole slope below her laid out clear. Every dark shape pressed into the white, and they could see her too, or at least they could see the crack in the rock. The only feature on that whole slope that could hide a shooter. And she watched a dozen weapons swing up toward her position at once. "Down," she told herself, and threw herself as flat as her frozen body would go, back into the crack, and the rock above her head came apart in a spray of chips and dust as their fire found her position and hammered it. Stone bit her cheek. Something hot creased her shoulder, whether rock or round, she couldn't tell. She pressed herself into the deepest part of the crack and let the mountain take the fire that was meant for her, and she thought, well, now they know exactly where I am. So much for the ghost. The fire stopped. She heard or felt the change in the slope, the shift of men rising from the snow. Now that they had her pinned, now that they thought they had her hiding, coming up fast to close the last of the distance while she cowered in her hole. That was the moment. She had 1 card left to play, and it was the oldest card there was. She let them come. She counted in her head, counted the seconds it would take them to cross the open ground, counted them, getting closer and closer. Holding herself down, playing dead, playing beaten, playing exactly the frightened, cornered animal they wanted her to be. And then when her count told her the nearest of them was almost on top of the crack, she came up out of the rock like something the mountain had spat out, and she fired her fourth round point blank into the closest man's chest, and he folded over the lip of the rock practically in her lap. And she was already turning third round, no second round now, turning to the next nearest shape and firing, and he went down too, and the rush broke. It broke. The men who had been charging her position scattered back down the slope in disorder because a hiding beaten sniper who suddenly rises up and kills two of you at arm's length is a far more terrifying thing than a distant shooter. It feels like the mountain itself came alive, and there is a limit to what even angry, grieving men will walk into. Avery slid back down into the crack, gasping, and she looked at what was left in her hand. One round. One. She had 6 enemy dead, scattered down the slope below her, and 1 round left in the whole world. And the men who'd scattered were not gone. They were only regrouping, gathering their nerve back up down in the white. And there were still a dozen of them at least, and she had 1 round and no more strength to rise up out of the rock and surprise anybody ever again. Her body was done. The shot into that man's chest had cost her something she could not get back. She could barely feel her legs now. The cold had stopped hurting, which she knew with a distant professional clarity was the worst sign of all, the sign that meant the end was close. One, she whispered to the last round, just you and me now. She thought about who that last round was for. There was an old grim logic to it, a logic every sniper who's ever been overrun knows and never says out loud. When you're down to your last round and the enemy is coming and there is no cavalry, the last round is not for them. The last round is for you, so that whatever they plan to do to the one who killed their commander, they never get the chance. She held the round in her frozen fingers, and she looked at it for a long moment, and then she chambered it and pointed her rifle back down the slope and decided it was for them after all. Because Brennan had been right about her in a way even Brennan didn't fully understand. She didn't quit, not the way other people meant it. She would not spend her last round on herself while there was still one enemy she could take with her. If they wanted her, they would have to climb up here and pay for her with 1 more of their own, and after that they could do whatever they wanted with what was left, because what was left wouldn't be her anymore, not really. She'd be gone by then. She could feel herself going. Come on then, she said down the slope to the men gathering their courage in the snow. 1 more of you. I've got 1 more of you in me. Who wants it? Down at the outpost, Captain Sullivan opened his eyes and made the decision that the book told him not to make. I'm sending a team, he said. Doyle looked at him. Sir, you heard me. Whoever's up there saved every man in this outpost. They killed the enemy commander with a shot that shouldn't be possible, and they turned an assault that would have wiped us out. And now that whole element is climbing a mountain to murder them for it. I'm not going to sit in this room where it's warm and let that happen. Not to somebody who did that for us. Not while I've got men who can climb. It's low odds, sir, I told you. Low. I know what you told me. Sullivan was already reaching for his gear. But you know as well as I do that low isn't 0. And I've spent 4 days refusing to treat low like it was 0, and it turns out I was right too. Somebody up there refused to quit on us. I'm not about to quit on them. He keyed the radio. Brennan. Sir. The answer came instantly, like the young man had been holding the handset the whole time. You said she was alive. You want to prove it. There was a half-second of silence, and then Brennan's voice came back, and it was shaking, but not with fear. Just tell me where to climb, sir. North Post, gear up. Full cold weather, load extra ammunition, medical. You're on the team. Doyle, you've got command of it. Take Brennan, take Ramirez, take whoever else you trust to keep their feet under them in that. Kim holds the line here with the rest. Sullivan looked at the old sergeant. Go get whoever's up there. And Doyle, go fast. Because I don't think fast is going to be fast enough, and I'd rather be wrong about that than right. Doyle nodded once, and there was something in the old man's weathered face that hadn't been there in 4 days. Something that looked almost like hope, and he turned and went. Up on the mountain, the enemy came again. They came smarter this time. No more charging up an open slope. They came low and spread wide, using the ground, giving her nothing, and she knew with her 1 round and her failing body that she could not stop this one. She could take one of them, the 1 round would buy her 1 man, and then they would be into the rocks and on top of her, and it would be finished. She picked her man, a shape moving low and steady up the left side, an officer, maybe someone the others were following, and she settled the crosshair on him. And she thought, all right, you're the one I take with me, and her finger found the trigger. And then from far below, from down toward the outpost, came a sound that stopped her. Gunfire. Not aimed at her, not from the men climbing toward her. From lower down the slope, from behind the enemy element, a sudden hammering of fire that tore into the men climbing toward her from below and behind. And she watched, hardly daring to understand it, as the shape she'd been about to shoot spun and dropped. Not from her, her round was still chambered, but from someone else's. Somebody was coming up the mountain. Somebody was coming up behind the enemy, catching them between the sniper above and the guns below, and the men who had been climbing to murder her suddenly found themselves the ones being hunted, caught on an open slope with fire coming from two directions at once, and their careful, smart advance came apart into confusion and panic. Avery lowered her rifle a fraction, her one round still unspent, and she stared down through the thinning snow at the fresh muzzle flashes climbing toward her, and she could not make sense of it, could not let herself believe it, because believing it and being wrong would break something in her that had held together for 4 impossible days. No, she whispered. No, don't. Don't you dare hope. You know better. But the flashes kept climbing, and over the wind, faint, torn to pieces by the storm, but unmistakably, undeniably human, undeniably American, undeniably real. She heard a voice she knew, a young voice, shouting her name up the mountain. Collins, Sergeant Collins, it's Brennan. We're coming, hold on, we're coming. And Sergeant Avery Collins, who did not quit, who had set down her own life like a pack off her shoulders, who had 1 round left and had been ready to spend it, and then spend herself, pressed her frozen face against the cold stock of her rifle and felt something break loose in her chest that 4 days of storm had not been able to touch. And for the first time since the radio went dark, she was not sure the wetness freezing on her cheeks was only from the wind. She heard the name again, torn and thin but real, and every instinct she had built over a lifetime told her not to trust it. Because the storm lied. Avery Collins had learned that in the last 4 days, better than she had ever wanted to learn it. The storm made voices out of wind, it made shapes out of snow. On the second night, delirious with cold, she had heard her own mother calling her from across the valley, clear as a bell, and she had almost crawled out of her shelter toward the sound before the working part of her mind slapped her back down and told her that her mother was 3,000 miles away, and the voice was the cold trying to walk her off a cliff. So when she heard Brennan's voice climbing the mountain toward her, the first thing she felt was not joy. It was suspicion. It was the flat, hard refusal of a professional who had been fooled by hope before and would not be fooled by it now. Not when being wrong meant lifting her head at the exact moment a real enemy was waiting for her to do it. It's not real, she told herself, pressing flatter into the rock. It's the cold. It's the same trick. Don't move. Don't you move for a voice. But the gunfire was real. That was the thing she could not explain away. The cold could make a voice, but the cold could not make muzzle flashes, could not make the enemy element below her spin and scatter and start dying from fire that was coming from behind them, from downslope, from the direction of the outpost. She watched 3 more of the men who had been climbing toward her fall, and none of them fell from her rifle because her rifle had not fired, because she still had 1 round chambered and unspent. Somebody else was killing them. Somebody real. And that meant the voice might be real too, and the collision of those 2 truths, the trained suspicion and the impossible evidence, held her frozen in the crack, unable to move, unable to answer, unable to do anything but watch and shake. 200 meters down the slope, Sergeant Doyle was laid out flat in the snow behind a fold of ground with his rifle bucking against his shoulder, and he was learning in real time exactly how right he had been to call the odds low. Ramirez left, he barked. 2 of them trying to peel off up the draw. Don't let them flank us. Got him, Sergeant. Ramirez shifted his fire, and the 2 shapes trying to slip up the draw pitched into the snow. They had caught the enemy element in the worst possible position, and Doyle knew it was pure luck, the kind of luck you did not get twice. The enemy had been climbing hard toward the ridge, all their attention up the mountain, all their fury pointed at the ghost above them, and Doyle's little team had come up the slope behind them through the whiteout and been on top of them before anyone thought to look down. It was the same mistake the enemy had made climbing toward Avery, the exact same one. The mistake of wanting the thing in front of you so badly that you forget to watch your own back. Now the hunters were the hunted caught on open ground between a sniper above and a squad below, and they were dying for it. But there were more of them than Doyle's team, a lot more. And once the shock wore off, the enemy would remember that, and then the numbers would start to matter again. "Brennan," Doyle snapped. "Brennan, get your head down and stop yelling. You're giving away every position we've got." But Brennan would not stop yelling. Brennan was up on one knee, firing and shouting her name up the mountain, and Doyle understood, even in the middle of it, that the boy was not being reckless out of stupidity. He was being reckless out of faith. He had spent 4 days swearing to a room full of men who'd already buried her that Sergeant Collins was alive, and now he was close enough to prove it or be proven wrong forever, and there was no power on that mountain. Not the cold, and not the enemy, and not Doyle's direct order that was going to keep him quiet. "Collins!" Brennan screamed again and fired and screamed. "Give me a sign, anything, just show me you're up there." Up in the rock, Avery heard the words, and something in the raw desperation of them. The way the boy's voice cracked apart on her name finally broke through the wall of her suspicion. The cold could fake a voice, but the cold could not fake that. It could not fake the specific particular sound of Private Brennan, a sound she knew, a sound she had heard him make when he was scared and trying not to be on 3 separate patrols, a sound that carried in it every argument he must have made on her behalf while she was up here dying. That was not the storm. The storm didn't love anybody. That was a boy who had refused to let them fold her flag. "Brennan," she breathed, and it was barely a sound at all. Then forcing it, dragging it up out of a chest that had almost no air left in it, louder, "Brennan." It was not loud enough. The wind ate it whole. She looked at her rifle. She looked at the 1 round still chambered, the round she had been saving for the last enemy, or for herself, and she understood what the sign had to be. She could not shout loud enough to be heard over the storm. But a rifle could. A rifle could say in a language every soldier on that mountain understood, "I am here. I am alive, and I am still in this fight." It would cost her the round. Her last one. If she fired it into the air as a signal, she would have nothing left. Nothing. And if this rescue failed, if Doyle's team was overrun, she would be utterly defenseless. Empty. It was by every rule of survival she had ever followed a foolish thing to do to spend your last round on a gesture. She spent it anyway. She got the rifle up, angled it away from the men below, up toward the empty storm, and with the last of the strength in her ruined finger, she fired her final round into the sky. The crack of it rolled down the mountain flat and hard, cutting through the wind for one clean instant, and down below, Private Brennan's whole body jerked toward the sound. "There!" he screamed. Doyle, there! Did you hear it? That was her. That was a rifle. She's alive. She's right up there. I told you. I told all of you." And Doyle, flat in the snow, killing enemy soldiers with methodical patience, heard the shot too, and closed his eyes for 1/2 second and let himself believe it. "All right," the old sergeant said, and there was iron back in his voice. "All right, son. She's alive. Now let's go get her before she isn't. Ramirez, Webb on me. We push up the slope, we keep these people pinned, and we do not stop climbing. Brennan, you're on point. Since you can't shut up anyway, you go straight for that shot. Move." They moved. But the enemy moved too, because the enemy had finally understood its situation, and a cornered enemy that understands its situation is the most dangerous kind. The surviving officer down in that valley, whoever had inherited the wreckage of the dead commander's assault, had by now grasped the whole shape of what was happening on the mountain. He had lost his commander to a ghost. He had sent a strong element up the slope to kill that ghost, and now that element was itself being butchered by a small team that had come up from the outpost. And that small team was the key. That small team had left the outpost, which meant the outpost for the first time in 4 days was weaker than it had been. He could not have both. He could throw everything at the mountain to overwhelm the rescue team and finally kill the sniper, or he could turn back toward the wounded, distracted outpost and try to salvage the assault his dead commander had planned. He was not a great commander, this man. If he had been, he might have understood that his real enemy was not any single soldier on that mountain, but the confusion in his own ranks, and that the right move was to withdraw, regroup, and come back when the storm had passed and his men had leaders again. But he was angry, and he was afraid of what his superiors would say about a commander lost to a single impossible shot. And angry, frightened men reached for revenge instead of victory. He ordered his men up the mountain. All of them. Everything he had left. Kill the sniper, kill the rescuers, wipe the ridge clean, and let the outpost wait. It was the wrong call. It was exactly the wrong call. But it was the call that meant the fight on the mountain was about to get much, much worse before it got better. Doyle felt the shift the way Sullivan had felt the shift down in the valley that sixth sense soldiers developed the feeling of an enemy committing itself. They're coming up in strength, he called to his team. All of them, I think, whole element. They've given up on the outpost, they want the mountain instead. Everybody find hard cover. We are about to be very outnumbered. Sergeant Ramirez said, if the whole element's coming up here, that means the outpost's clear. The outpost is Kim's problem now, Doyle said. The mountain is ours. Dig in. Up in the rock, Avery heard the volume of fire below. Her change swelled deepen, and she understood without being told that the enemy had committed everything to the slope, and that the men who had come to save her were now badly outnumbered on open ground, and that she, out of ammunition, out of strength, out of everything, could do nothing but lie there and listen to them fight and die for her. That was the cruelest thing the whole day had done to her. Worse than the cold. Worse than the impossible shot. To be the reason men were climbing into fire and to have nothing left to give them, no round to fire, no strength to move, no way to help, only the terrible helplessness of a soldier who has spent everything and must now watch others spend themselves on her behalf. Don't, she whispered down the slope to Brennan, to Doyle, to all of them. Don't you die for me. I'm not worth it. Just one soldier. I'm not worth all of you. Go back. Go back. But she knew they wouldn't. She knew because she knew what she would do if it were reversed, if it were Brennan up here on the rock and her down there in the snow. She would climb. She would climb into anything. That was the thing that bound them all together, the thing that was worth more than any single life, the unspoken promise that no one gets left on the mountain. And it was the most beautiful and most terrible thing about the whole bloody profession. And it was going to get good men killed coming after her, and she could not stop it. So she did the only thing left that she could do. She could not fire. She could not fight. But she could be a target that drew the enemy's eyes, could keep them looking up at her crack in the rock instead of down at the team climbing toward them. She could make noise. She could show herself just enough at the mouth of the crack, an empty rifle in her hands, and let the enemy waste their fear and their attention and their bullets on the ghost above them, while the real threat closed from below. It was the last thing she had to offer, her own visibility, her own body as bait. She dragged herself to the mouth of the crack, and she showed herself in the enemy fire that had been climbing toward Doyle's team, swung back up towards her, rounds cracking off the rock all around her, and she pressed herself just barely into cover and let them shoot at her, let them spend themselves on her, bought the rescue team seconds and then minutes with the only currency she had left, which was the enemy's hatred of the ghost who had killed their commander. That's it, she gritted through her teeth as the rock came apart around her. Look at me. Keep looking at me. Forget about them. It's me you want. Here I am. Down the slope, Brennan saw it, saw the enemy fire lift off his own team and swing up toward the rock. Saw why, saw what she was doing, understood in an instant that Sergeant Collins, out of ammunition, half dead, was deliberately drawing fire onto herself to protect the men coming to save her. She's covering us, he shouted, and his voice broke completely now, all the way into something raw and furious and grieving all at once. Doyle, she's drawing their fire. She's got nothing. She's got no rounds left, and she's standing up in it to cover us. We have to go. We have to go now. Move, move, move. And they moved faster than was safe, faster than the odds allowed up through the last of the open ground, because a soldier will find a speed she did not know she had when she watches someone else spending their last breath to buy it for her. The enemy, its attention split, and swinging its leadership, shattered its numbers, no longer able to make up for the confusion in its ranks, began at last to come apart. Doyle's team was in among them now, close and up close. The enemy's advantage in numbers meant less than the enemy's disadvantage in nerve. Men who had climbed a mountain in a storm to avenge a commander they had watched die to an invisible bullet did not have deep reserves of courage left to spend. And when the reserves ran out, they broke the way men always eventually break, and they began to fall back down the slope, and the falling back became a rout. and the route carried them off the mountain and away into the white from which they had come. And then quite suddenly it was over, or the fighting part of it was over, and the only sound left on the mountain was the wind and the ragged breathing of exhausted men, and Private Brennan was scrambling the last few feet up the icy rock toward the crack, where a shape lay slumped and unmoving, and he was calling her name, calling it and calling it. "Collins, Sergeant! Sergeant Collins! I'm here! I'm here! It's Brennan! I've got you! Look at me! Come on! Look at me!" She looked at him. She was almost gone. He could see that the moment he got his hands on her, could feel it in how little of her there seemed to be left inside the frozen gear, in the terrible slowness of her eyes finding his face. But she looked at him, and her cracked, colorless lips moved, and he had to put his ear practically against them to hear the words come out on the last thread of her breath. "I held them off," she whispered, "long enough." "You did," Brennan said, and he was crying openly now, and he did not care who saw, and Doyle was there beside him, and Ramirez behind, already tearing open the medical kit, already working to put back into her body some of the warmth the mountain had spent 4 days stealing out of it. "You held them off. You did it. You saved all of us. Every single one of us. Now you hold on for me. Sergeant, you hear me? You held them off long enough, and now you hold on. Because I did not climb this whole godforsaken mountain to carry you down as anything but breathing." And far below in a warm command room, Captain Mark Sullivan sat with a radio in his hand. And this time when it crackled, the voice that came through the static was Doyle's, exhausted and shaking and alive. "Command, this is the mountain team," Doyle said. "Be advised, we have her. Repeat, we have Sergeant Collins. She's alive, sir. She's alive." Sullivan set the handset down very slowly, and he put his face in his hands, and for a long moment the captain, who had never let a room see him afraid, let the empty command room see him weep. Getting her down the mountain was going to kill her, and Doyle knew it, and he was going to try anyway. That was the brutal truth waiting for them the moment the fighting stopped. They had her. She was alive. And alive in that place in that storm only meant that she had not finished dying yet. Doyle knelt over her in the snow with the medical kit spread open, and he did the fast, cold arithmetic of a man who had carried too many people off too many mountains. And the arithmetic told him that Sergeant Collins was hours, maybe less, from being past saving, and that the outpost, with its warmth and its stretchers and whatever the medics could rig, was a long, punishing climb down through terrain that had already tried to kill all of them once. "Talk to me, Ramirez," Doyle said, working. "Give me a real number on her." Ramirez had his gloves off his bare hands, moving over her, checking the things you check, and his face when he looked up said most of it before his mouth did. "Core temp's way down, Sergeant. Way down. She's got frostbite in both hands, both feet, probably more we can't see. She's been bleeding from that shoulder, not bad, but for 4 days on top of everything else. Honestly, I don't know how she's still talking. I don't know how she made that shot. A person shouldn't be able to do what she did in this condition. It's not possible." "She did it anyway," Doyle said. "So don't tell me what's not possible. Tell me what she needs." "She needs to be warm, and she needs it an hour ago," Ramirez said. "Everything else is second to that. We keep her cold. We lose her, simple as that. Then we get her warm and we get her down." Doyle was already stripping off his own outer layer, and around him, without being told, the rest of the team was doing the same, Ramirez and Webb peeling off their own warmth to wrap around her. Because that was the other unspoken thing. The thing that came right after no one gets left on the mountain, which was that you gave what you had off your own back, out of your own body, to the one who couldn't make it on their own. Brennan had her head in his lap, and he would not let go of her, and he kept talking to her low and steady, the way you talk to someone to keep them tethered to the world. "Stay with me, Sergeant. You hear that? That's my team taking the coats off their own backs for you. That's how much we came for you. So you don't get to check out. Now that'd be rude, you understand? After all this, real rude. Stay with me." Her eyes drifted to him. She was so far down inside the cold that her voice came out in pieces. "Brennan. Yeah, it's me." "You talk," she whispered, and something that might have been a smile ghosted across her frozen face. "Too much. Always did." And Brennan laughed a wet, broken, helpless laugh, because if she had it in her to insult him, then she had it in her to fight. And that was the first real hope he'd felt since he put his hands on her. Down at the outpost, Captain Sullivan had wiped his face and picked the handset back up, And the softness was gone from his voice because there was no more time for softness. There was only the next problem, and the next problem was that his people were stranded on a mountain with a dying woman and a storm that had not finished with any of them. Doyle command, what do you need? A miracle, sir, Doyle said. Barring that, I need a plan to get her down alive, and I need it to account for the fact that carrying her fast enough to save her and carrying her careful enough not to finish her are two different things pulling in two different directions. How long to bring her down the way you came up? Too long, sir. That's the honest answer. The route we climbed hauling her on an improvised litter in this hours. She doesn't have hours. Sullivan looked at the map. He had been looking at that map for 4 days, and he knew every line on it, and he made himself look at it now. Not as a captain protecting an outpost, but as a man trying to save one soldier, which is a different way of looking at a map entirely. There's a draw, he said slowly. West of your position, runs down off the ridge toward the valley floor. It's steeper than your route, and I wouldn't send healthy men down it in good weather, but it's shorter. Cuts your descent by more than half if you can get her down it in one piece. And if we can't get her down it in one piece, sir, we lose all of them at once instead of just her, Doyle said. That's the trade you're describing. I know exactly what I'm describing, Sergeant. Sullivan's voice was flat and hard. I'm describing the only route that gets her to a medic before her heart stops. You want the safe route, take it and bury her at the bottom of it. You want a chance, take the draw. Your call, you're on the ground. But make it fast because every second we spend on this radio is a second she doesn't have. There was a silence on the line and then Doyle said, the draw, we'll take the draw. Send everything you've got to meet us at the bottom of it. Warm gear, medics, everything. Because when we come off that mountain, we are going to need to put her straight into something that can save her and there won't be a second to spare. It's already moving, Sullivan said. My man. Kim's assembling a reception element right now. Half the outpost, Doyle. Half the outpost is coming to the bottom of that draw to bring you in. You just get her there. They got her there, or they began the terrible work of getting her there, and it was every foot of it exactly as bad as Doyle had feared. The draw was a knife. That was how Doyle would describe it later on the rare occasions he described it at all. A steep, narrow ice slick cut in the mountain that dropped away beneath their boots and offered nothing to hold on to. And they went down it carrying a dying woman lashed into an improvised litter of rifles and coats, and every step was a negotiation with death theirs and hers both. Webb slipped once and went down hard and slid 10 feet before Ramirez caught his collar and hauled him back. And for one heart-stopping second, the whole litter tilted toward the drop before 4 sets of hands dragged it back to safety. Nobody spoke after that. There was no breath to spare for speaking. There was only the descent and the cold and the weight of her and the shared wordless refusal to be the reason she didn't make it. Keep her level. Doyle kept saying the only words he allowed himself. Keep her level. Keep her warm. Keep her moving. Level, warm, moving. That's all there is now. Level, warm, moving. And Brennan at the front of the litter walking backward down a mountain he could barely see, kept up his steady stream of talk to the woman lashed to it because he had decided somewhere on that descent that as long as he was talking to her, she couldn't leave that. His voice was the rope holding her to the world, and he was not going to drop it. You know what the first thing I'm going to do when we get you warm is, Sergeant, I'm going to tell every single one of those veterans who wrote you off. Every one of them, Doyle, no offense. None taken, Doyle grunted. Keep talking. I'm going to walk right up to every man who said nobody survives 4 days out here. And I'm going to say, you see that woman? You see her breathing. That's the one you buried. That's the ghost. And she killed the enemy commander with a shot that shouldn't exist. And then she held off a whole element with a rifle and drew their fire onto herself to cover us. And she did it all half frozen to death. And you folded her flag in your head on day 2. That's what I'm going to say. His voice cracked. So you got to stay alive to let me say it, Sergeant. You can't make a liar out of me now. Not after 4 days. Halfway down the draw, she stopped responding. Ramirez caught it first, felt the change through the litter, and called the halt, and they set her down on a ledge barely wide enough to hold them. And Ramirez had his hands on her and his ear to her chest, and his face went white. She's crashing. Sergeant, she's crashing. Her heart's, I can barely find it. Then find it and hold it, Doyle said, dropping to his knees. Whatever you have to do. We are not losing her on this ledge after all of this. We are not. And Brennan, 22 years old, who had never watched anyone die and did not intend to start now, took Sergeant Avery Collins's frozen face in both his bare hands and put his forehead against hers and said her name over and over, low and fierce, an order and a prayer and a plea all at once. No, no, you don't. You do not get to do this. Not now. Not after you made that shot. Not after everything. You held them off long enough. You said so yourself. And now the hard part's over. Now, all you have to do is let us carry you. That's it. That's all. Just let us carry you. Just stay. Just stay. Just stay. And whether it was Ramirez's hands or Brennan's voice or the simple, stubborn, animal refusal of a woman who had never once in her life quit when quitting was the reasonable thing to do, her heart, which had been fading, held. It steadied. It came back thin and unsteady, but there and Ramirez felt it come back under his hands and let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for a year. She's back. She's back. Okay. Okay, let's move. Let's move before she changes her mind. They moved. At the bottom of the draw, half the outpost was waiting in the storm. Kim had brought them every man who could be spared and a few who couldn't, and they had come out into the teeth of the weather they had been hiding from for 4 days. And they stood at the foot of that murderous cut in the mountain with stretchers and warm gear and medical supplies and a fierce collective determination that you could feel coming off them like heat. Because word had spread. Of course it had spread. The whole outpost knew by now what had happened on that mountain, knew that the sniper they'd written off had saved every one of their lives with an impossible shot, and then held off an enemy element single-handed, and there was not a man among them who was going to stand inside a warm building while she was carried down a mountain dying. When the litter finally came off the bottom of the draw, carried by 4 men who could barely stand, the reception element surged forward as 1 in a dozen hands took the weight that 4 sets of hands had carried for hours, and Sergeant Avery Collins was lifted and wrapped and warmed and rushed toward the outpost by men who had never met her, who knew her only as a name on a radio that had gone silent, who owed her everything, and were determined to pay even a fraction of it back. Kim reached Doyle as the litter was rushed past and caught the old sergeant, who was swaying on his feet, and held him up. Doyle, we've got her. You did it. You can stop now. We've got her. And Doyle, who had climbed a mountain and fought an enemy and carried a dying woman down a knife of ice, looked at Kim with the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has spent absolutely everything he had and said, "Don't let her die, Lieutenant. Not now. Not after all of us went and got her. Don't you let her die." "We won't," Kim said. "We won't." 20 minutes later, Sergeant Avery Collins was inside the outpost in the warmest room they had, surrounded by every medic and every heat source and every scrap of medical skill the platoon possessed, and Captain Mark Sullivan stood in the doorway and watched them work on her and did not say a word, because there was nothing for a captain to do now except stay out of the way and let the people with the skills do the saving. She was not out of danger. The medics said so bluntly in the flat way medics talk when they don't want to give false hope. The cold had done deep damage. Her hands and feet were badly frostbitten, and there was no way yet to know how much of them could be saved. Her core temperature was catastrophically low, and bringing it back up too fast could stop her heart as surely as the cold could. She was fighting infection from the shoulder wound. She had spent 4 days doing to her body what 4 days of Arctic storm does to a body, and even now, warm and safe and surrounded by people trying to save her, she balanced on the edge and could still slip off it. But she was breathing, and every hour she kept breathing was an hour that tilted the odds a little further toward the living. Sullivan came to sit beside her sometime in the deep middle of that first night when the medics had done what they could, and it was down to waiting, and he sat in the dark beside a woman who could not hear him, the way he had sat with a dead radio 4 days before, and he talked to her the same way, because it turned out that talking to Avery Collins when she couldn't answer was a habit he'd formed and couldn't break. "I want you to know something," he said quietly. "I almost didn't send them up the mountain for you." He turned his cap over in his hands. "The book says you don't do it. The book says you don't strip your defense and throw men into a storm chasing one soldier who's probably already gone. Every rule I've ever been taught said hold your position and accept the loss. And I sat in that command room and I did the math, and the math said don't go." He was quiet for a moment. "And then I thought about the fact that you didn't do the math. You had every reason to lie down in that rock and die. Nobody would have blamed you. Nobody would have even known. But you looked at an impossible shot and you took it anyway because taking it might save us and probably wasn't the same as certainly to you. So I figured the least I could do was throw out my own math the way you threw out yours. Probably you were dead, but probably isn't certainly. You taught me that, Sergeant. From 3,000 meters up a mountain without saying a word, you taught me that. She didn't answer. She couldn't. But somewhere in the days that followed, she began slowly, stubbornly, in the only way she had ever done anything to come back. It was not fast. Nothing about it was fast. There were nights the medics thought they'd lost her, and mornings she surprised everyone by being a little stronger than she'd been the day before. There was the long, grim reckoning with her hands and her feet, the parts the cold had taken and would not give back, the surgeries that came later, when they finally got her to a real facility, the slow accounting of what 4 days on the mountain had cost her body. There was pain, a great deal of it, the kind that comes when frozen flesh remembers it's alive. But she was alive to feel it. And Brennan visited every single day and made good on his promise and told her in detail about every veteran he'd confronted, about the looks on their faces, about Doyle actually apologizing gruffly in his way for calling the odds the way he'd called them. And the men of the platoon came 1 and 2 at a time to sit with the woman who had saved them, awkward and grateful and unsure what to say to someone they owed their lives to. And mostly just saying thank you, which was never enough and was somehow also exactly enough. And there was a moment weeks in when Avery Collins was strong enough to sit it up and strong enough to talk in full sentences again, and Captain Sullivan came to see her, and she looked at him with those dry, steady eyes that had come all the way back from wherever they'd been, and she said the first fully clear thing she'd said since the mountain. "You came for me." "Damn right we did," Sullivan said. "You shouldn't have." She said it without drama, as a simple professional observation. "One soldier against the whole defense of the outpost. That's a bad trade, Captain. You know it is." "I do know it," Sullivan said. "And I'd make it again tomorrow. So would every man who climbed that mountain. So don't you sit there and tell me you weren't worth it, Sergeant, because you don't get a vote on that. The rest of us already took it, and it wasn't close." And Avery Collins, who had made an impossible shot and held off an army and been ready to spend her last round and her last breath on people who thought she was already dead, looked at her captain for a long moment, and then she looked away toward the window, and for once in her life, she did not have a dry, steady answer ready, because there wasn't one, because some debts are too big to answer and can only be sat with in silence. She would carry it, that silence, and the men who'd come for her would carry theirs, all of them bound now by a night on a mountain that none of them would ever fully be able to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. And outside the window, the weather was clearing, at last the great storm finally breaking apart and drifting off toward wherever storms go to die. And the first pale light in 4 days was coming down over the valley, over the outpost, over the mountain, where a woman had refused, against all reason, to quit. The storm was breaking, but the fight to keep her alive was not over, and the days that followed the mountain would test the platoon in a way the enemy never had. Because there was a problem, and it arrived the morning after they brought her down, and it arrived in the form of a radio transmission from higher command that Sullivan took alone in the command room and did not share with anyone at first, because he needed to think about what it meant before the men got wind of it. The enemy was not finished. That was the message. The element they had shattered on the mountain had been only a part of a larger force, and that larger force, having lost a commander and a strong detachment to a single sniper and a handful of rescuers, was regrouping down in the valley, and it was angry, and it was still numerically superior to everything the outpost could put in the field. The storm that had been killing all of them was also the only thing that had kept the enemy from bringing its full strength to bear. And now the storm was lifting, and when it lifted fully, there would be nothing between the outpost and a force that badly wanted revenge. Sullivan sat with that for a long time. Then he did the thing he always did, which was to stop treating it as one enormous, unsolvable problem and start breaking it into pieces small enough to fight. And the first piece, the piece that mattered most, was that for 4 days, the enemy had believed the outpost was blind and broken and easy, and the enemy had been wrong, and the enemy did not yet fully understand how wrong. They still didn't know how the shot had been made. They didn't know it had come from a single wounded soldier. In their minds, some part of them surely believed the mountain itself held a nest of shooters, an overwatch capability that could reach anywhere in the valley and kill anyone at will. That fear that ignorance was a weapon, the same weapon Avery had used, the weapon of being underestimated in reverse. Kim, Sullivan said when he'd finally worked it through, get me the veterans. Doyle, Ramirez, the ones who were on the mountain. And get me Brennan. We've got a decision to make, and I want the people who climbed that thing in the room for it. They came exhausted, some of them barely healed from the descent, and Sullivan laid it out for them, straight the way he laid everything out straight, because he had learned long ago that men fight harder for a truth than for a comfortable lie. The enemy's regrouping, he said, full strength or close to it down in the valley. When this weather lifts all the way they're coming, and there's more of them than there is of us, and we don't have Collins on a ridge to even those odds anymore, because Collins is fighting for her life in the next room and won't be shooting anything for a long time, if ever again. He let that sit. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you it looks good. It doesn't. But I climbed inside how she thinks these last few days, watching what she did, and I think she left us a way through without even meaning to. How's that, sir? Doyle said. They're afraid of the mountain, Sullivan said. They think there's an overwatch up there that can reach anywhere. One shot did that. One impossible shot from a place they couldn't find. They don't know it was one wounded soldier out of ammunition. In their heads, that ridge is death, and every man who tried to climb it got slaughtered, which from their side is exactly what happened. So we let them keep believing it. We make that fear do our fighting for us. Ramirez leaned forward. You want to put people back up on that ridge. I want to make them think I already have, Sullivan said. A small team, volunteers only, because I won't order a man back up that thing after what it did to us, not to hold it, to be seen holding it, to fire from it, move on. It'd make the enemy believe the nest is still up there, still watching, still able to reach down and kill their commanders the second they show themselves. If they believe that they'll hesitate, and a hesitating enemy in this terrain, in this cold, is an enemy that gives us time. Time for the weather to shift again, time for relief to reach us, time for anything. The room was quiet, weighing it. It's a bluff, sir, Doyle said slowly. A good one, but if they push hard enough to test whether there's really a shooter up there, the men we put on that ridge are the ones who pay for the bluff being called. I know it, Sullivan said. That's why it's volunteers. That's why I'm asking, not ordering. And that's why the first name on the list is mine. That landed hard in the room. A captain did not put himself on a bluff like that. A captain stayed in the command room where the decisions got made. Everyone in the room knew it, and everyone in the room understood in the same instant why Sullivan was doing it. He had almost not gone up the mountain for Avery. He had sat in this room and done the math, and the math had said, don't go. And he had gone anyway, and it had worked, and something in the man had changed because of it. He was done sending other people up mountains while he stayed warm. If there was a bluff to be run from that murderous ridge, he was going to be the one standing on it. Then the second name's mine, Brennan said immediately. Son, Doyle started. Don't, Brennan said. Don't you tell me to sit this one out. I climbed that mountain once. I know the ground now. I know the ridge. I know the draw. I know how the enemy comes at it. There's maybe 5 people in this whole outpost who have actually been up there and lived, and 4 of them are in this room, and you're going to need every one of us if this bluff is going to look real. So don't tell me to sit down. Sergeant Collins didn't sit down. I'm not going to either. Sullivan looked at the young private for a long moment, and something passed across his face that might have been pride and might have been grief and was probably both. All right, he said quietly. All right, Brennan, you're on the list. And so it was decided, and so it was done. And in the last gray hours before the weather broke fully, a small team of volunteers climbed back up onto the ridge that had nearly killed them all, not to fight, but to perform a fight to be shapes on the high ground that the enemy could see and fear. It should not have worked. By every rule of war, it was a desperate, threadbare gamble, a handful of exhausted men pretending to be a force that no longer existed. But it worked because fear is the most powerful thing on any battlefield, and the enemy's fear had been carved into them by a single impossible shot that they still could not explain. When the weather finally lifted and the enemy commanders lifted their field glasses toward the outpost, the first thing they saw was movement on the ridge, the high ground where their previous commander had died, where a strong element had climbed and been butchered, and every instinct they had screamed that the ghost was still up there, still watching, still able to reach down and pluck the life out of any officer who dared to give an order in the open. And they hesitated. They hesitated for an hour and then for a day, and the hesitation cost them the one thing they could not afford to lose, which was momentum. Because in the space of that hesitation, the weather cleared fully, and a clear sky meant that the outpost calls for relief, which the storm had swallowed for days, finally went out and were finally heard. And somewhere beyond the valley, a relief column began to move. Sullivan stood on the ridge through it all, cold to the bone, running a bluff with his own life as the collateral. And beside him, Brennan watched the valley through a scope and reported every enemy movement in a low, steady voice. And the two of them, captain and private, held that high ground with an empty threat and sheer nerve, buying hours, buying a day, buying survival. One hesitation at a time. It was in its own way, its own kind of impossible shot, and they made it the way Avery had made hers, by refusing to accept that it couldn't be done. Down in the outpost in the warm room where the medics fought their own battle, Avery Collins drifted in and out, and in one of her clearer moments, Kim was there. And she asked in her cracked, slow voice what was happening, and Kim, who did not believe in lying to soldiers, told her. Told her about the enemy regrouping, told her about the bluff on the ridge, told her that Sullivan and Brennan and the others were up there right now running her own trick back at the enemy, using the fear she had carved into them to hold the whole line together with nothing but nerve. And Avery Collins, who had made her peace with dying twice, now lay in that warm room and listened, and when Kim finished, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said something that Kim carried with him for the rest of his life. "Tell them," she whispered. "The trick only works if they believe it themselves. The enemy can smell a bluff, but they can't smell a man who's decided he'd actually rather die on that ridge than let them through. So the ones up there, they can't be pretending. They have to mean it, all the way down. That's the secret. It was never about the shot. It was about being willing to spend everything and having the enemy know it." She closed her eyes. "Tell them to mean it, and they'll hold." Kim carried the message up the mountain, and it reached Sullivan on the cold ridge. And Sullivan understood it the way he had come to understand everything Avery Collins tried to teach him, slowly, and then all at once. And he looked out at the valley full of an enemy that outnumbered him, and he found somewhere in himself that he did mean it all the way down, and the meaning it must have shown because the enemy never came. The relief column arrived on the third day after the storm broke, and its arrival ended the standoff without a shot, because a hesitating enemy that has been bluffed for 3 days does not suddenly find its courage when fresh forces roll up over the horizon. They withdrew. The whole force, all of it, melted back into the mountains in the distance from which it had come, taking with it the body of a commander killed by a bullet from nowhere, and the memory of a ridge that could not be climbed. And the outpost, again, as every reasonable expectation stood. Sullivan came down off the ridge on legs he could barely feel, and Brennan came down beside him, and they went straight to the warm room, still crusted in ice, and they stood over Sergeant Avery Collins, and Sullivan said, "It held. Your trick held. They're gone." And Avery, weak, ruined alive, looked up at the two frozen men who had run her bluff and held her line, and she said the only thing there was to say, the thing that summed up all of it, the mountain and the shot and the descent and the bluff and the survival of 40 men who should have died. "Good," she said. "Then it was worth it." And it was. Every impossible piece of it. It was worth it. Worth it. She said the word and closed her eyes, and everyone in that room believed her. And yet the story of what it had cost her was only just beginning to be written. Because surviving the mountain was one thing, and living with what the mountain had taken was another. And in the weeks that followed, as they moved her from the outpost to a field hospital, and then to a real one, far from that frozen valley, Avery Collins had to learn a truth that no impossible shot could solve. The cold does not give back what it takes. The surgeons told her plainly in the flat, careful way surgeons talk that the frostbite had gone too deep in places, that there were parts of her hands and her feet that could not be saved, that the woman who walked out of that hospital would not be the same woman who had lain in the crack in the rock and reached down into the valley to kill a commander she could not hear. She took the news this way. She took everything without drama, with those dry, steady eyes, and she asked only one question, and it was the question that mattered more to her than anything else in the world. "Will I shoot again?" The surgeon hesitated, and the hesitation was the answer before the words came. "Honestly, Sergeant, I don't know. The damage to your hands, the fine control a shooter needs, the feeling in your fingertips, that's exactly what the cold went after first. You might. With time, with therapy, with more work than most people would ever be willing to do. But I won't lie to you and tell you it's likely. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that the shot you made on that mountain was the last one you'll ever make. And there it was. The cruelest twist of the whole ordeal, delivered not by an enemy or a storm, but by a quiet doctor in a warm room. The thing she had trained her whole life to become, the weapon she had made of herself, might have been spent forever in that single impossible moment when she saved 40 men. She had traded her hands for their lives. Nobody had asked her to. She would do it again without a second's pause. But the trade was real, and now she had to live inside it. Brennan visited her in the hospital, made the long journey to do it, and he found her sitting up staring at her bandaged hands, and he did not know what to say. And so for once in his life, he said nothing and just sat with her. After a long while, she spoke, still looking at her hands. You know what's funny, Brennan? Everybody keeps telling me how brave it was. The shot, holding them off, drawing their fire. She turned the ruined hands over slowly. But I wasn't brave. Brave is when you're scared and you do it anyway. I wasn't scared up there at the end. I was just doing math. It was the only thing left that made sense. The brave one was you. You climbed a mountain in a storm for somebody everybody else had already buried. That's brave. That's the kind of thing I don't think I could have done. You did do it, Brennan said quietly. You climbed a mountain for 40 people who couldn't climb it themselves. You just did it with a rifle instead of your feet. She looked at him then, and something moved behind her eyes, and she almost smiled. When did you get smart, Private? On a mountain, Brennan said, watching you. The official report, when it was finally written, did not tell the story the way Brennan told it. It couldn't. For reasons of operational security, for reasons that had to do with things far above the pay grade of anyone who had actually been in that valley, the shot from the ridge was recorded in vague, bloodless language, the enemy commander's death attributed to unspecified friendly action, the name of the sniper who made it scrub clean off the page. There would be no medal ceremony with cameras. There would be no headline. The 4,000-meter bullet that saved an entire platoon would never officially exist, and neither in the record would the woman who fired it. Avery didn't care about that. She had never done any of it for a record. But Brennan cared, and Doyle cared, and Sullivan cared, and they discovered the way soldiers always discover that there is a truth that lives above and beyond any official report, and that truth is the story soldiers tell each other, and that story cannot be scrubbed by anyone. So the story spread. Not in documents, in the low voices of men on cold nights at other outposts, in the disbelieving retellings of soldiers who had heard it from soldiers who had heard it from someone who was actually there. It grew in the telling, the way true stories do, until the range crept upward and the storm grew fiercer and the odds grew longer. But the heart of it stayed exactly true, because the heart of it did not need exaggerating. A wounded sniper given up for dead, alone on a mountain in a killing storm, had seen an enemy commander give the order to wipe out her platoon and had reached down across an impossible distance and killed him with a single shot, and then had held off an entire element with an empty rifle and her own body as bait and had lived. They gave her a name in the telling because the report had taken her real one. They called her the sniper in the storm. They called it the shot from nowhere. And at that one particular outpost buried deep in the mountains, the men who had actually been there, the men who owed her their lives, gave her a name that stuck, a name that got passed down to every soldier who ever rotated through that place afterward, a name that turned a real woman into something close to a legend. They called her Blackbird, because a blackbird is a small, dark thing you never see coming that sits silent and patient in the worst weather and then moves once decisively and is gone. The name fit her so perfectly that even Avery, when she finally heard it years later, had to admit it was a good one. But the legend was not the end of her story, and this is the part the Whispers never got right, because the Whispers wanted a myth, and Avery Collins refused to be a myth. She was a person, and a person does not vanish into legend. A person has to get up the next morning and figure out how to live. And live she did. She did the impossible thing one more time, the way she had done it on the mountain by refusing to accept that it couldn't be done. She went back. Months of surgery and more months of therapy work that was slower and more painful and more discouraging than anything the enemy had ever thrown at her work, with no glory in it at all. Just the grinding daily labor of teaching ruined hands to do again what they had done before. The surgeon had told her it wasn't likely. She had heard that word before, likely, and its cousin probably, and she had learned on a mountain that probably was not certainly, that probably left a door open just wide enough for someone stubborn enough to force their way through it. So she forced her way through, day after daily, long after anyone reasonable would have accepted the diagnosis and moved on to a quieter life. She worked those hands and she cursed them and she coaxed them the way she had coaxed her frozen fingers on the mountain. Come on, work just a little more, then you can quit, and the hands slowly, unwillingly came back. Not all the way. They never came all the way back. There were things she had lost for good, and she made her peace with them, the way she made her peace with everything without complaint. But she came back far enough. And there came a day, more than a year after the mountain, when Sergeant Avery Collins lay down behind a rifle again and settled her cheek against the stock and found the small, still pond of silence between two beats of her heart and sent a round downrange and hit exactly what she was aiming at. It was not a 4,000-meter shot. It was an ordinary shot at an ordinary range, the kind she could have made in her sleep before the mountain. But she wept when she made it alone quietly, because it meant the mountain had not taken from her the one thing she had been most afraid to lose, the thing that was not really about the rifle at all, but about being herself, about still being the person she had spent her whole life becoming. She was still a weapon. The storm had not been able to change that. Nothing could. She served on quieter now, older in ways that had nothing to do with years, and the men who served alongside her mostly never knew that the calm sergeant with the scarred hands who could still outshoot soldiers half her age was the blackbird of the whispered stories. She didn't tell them. She never told anyone. It was not modesty exactly. It was that the story belonged to all of them, to Sullivan and Brennan and Doyle and Ramirez and Webb and every man who had climbed that mountain or held that ridge or stood in that reception element at the bottom of the draw. And it did not feel right to her to take a story that many people had bled for and wear it like it was hers alone. Brennan made a career of it, the telling. He never stopped. Long after they had gone their separate ways, whenever soldiers gathered and the story started, Brennan would wait for the right moment, and then he would tell them about the sniper in the storm, and he would tell it true. And at the end, when the disbelieving young soldiers would ask if it had really happened, if any of it was real, Brennan would just smile and say, "I carried her down that mountain myself. I had her blood on my hands and her breath on my ear when she told me she'd held them off long enough. Don't tell me it wasn't real. I was there." Captain Mark Sullivan carried it differently. He carried it as the lesson that had changed how he led men for the rest of his life. He had sat in a command room and done the math, and the math had said, "Don't go," and he had gone anyway because a wounded soldier 3,000 meters up a mountain had thrown out her own math and taken an impossible shot, and it had worked, and he had never again let the math be the only voice in the room. For the rest of his command, whenever the safe choice and the right choice pulled in different directions, he heard her voice, the voice he had talked to through a dead radio for 4 days. And he remembered that probably was not certainly, and he made the harder call more often than not, and more often than not it was the right one. And on the coldest nights, at that outpost buried deep in the mountains, when a new storm would come howling down off the peaks and the wind would throw itself against the walls, and the young soldiers standing watch would feel the old fear that the cold and the dark always bring, the veterans would tell them the story to keep them steady. They would point up at the ridge, invisible in the blowing snow, and they would tell the new ones that, a long time ago in weather just like this, everyone had given up on a soldier who was still out there, and that soldier had been the only thing standing between the whole platoon and death, and nobody had known it, and she had saved them all anyway, asking nothing, expecting nothing from a place where no help could reach her. And they would tell the young ones the lesson that came out of it, the lesson that was really the whole point of the story, the thing worth remembering when the storm is loud and the night is long and it feels like no one is coming and no one even knows you're there. The silence is not empty. When the radio goes dead and the wind is screaming and you cannot see 40 feet in front of you and every reasonable voice tells you the worst has already happened, do not fold the flag in your mind. Do not give up on the ones who have gone quiet, and do not give up on yourself when you are the one the world has gone quiet on. Because somewhere out in that silence, more often than the odds should ever allow, there is someone who has not quit. Someone doing the math. Someone breaking the impossible into pieces small enough to fight. Someone waiting patient and cold and unseen for the one moment when everything can be changed. The silence is not empty. Sometimes it is a wounded soldier in a crack in the rock, choosing to spend the last of herself on people who think she is already gone. Sometimes it is a young private refusing to stop believing, climbing a mountain in a storm for a ghost. Sometimes it is a captain throwing out the book and half an outpost walking into the weather they feared, and men taking the coats off their own backs. And sometimes on the worst night of your life, when you are certain no one is out there and no one is coming, the silence is a held breath in a slow heartbeat, in a single bullet already on its way across an impossible distance, 6 long seconds of nothing that are about to change everything. Sergeant Avery Collins lived a long life after that mountain. She healed and she served and she grew old and she carried her scars and her silence with the same quiet steadiness she had carried everything. And she never once called herself a hero, and she never once accepted that what she did was brave, and she went to her rest insisting to the very end that she had only been doing math, only doing the job, only doing the one thing that made sense when everything else had failed. But the soldiers of that outpost knew better. They knew exactly what she was. And every time a storm rolled down off those mountains for years and years after she was gone, they remembered her, and they told the new ones her story, and they held the line a little steadier for the knowing of it. She was the shot from nowhere. She was the sniper in the storm. She was the blackbird. She was the one who did not quit when quitting was the only reasonable thing left to do. And because she did not quit, 40 men lived, and their children lived, and their children's children, an entire unbroken chain of life, reaching down through the years, all of it hanging once on a single held breath in a single impossible shot fired by a dying woman who nobody knew was still alive. That is the whole truth of it. That is the story exactly as it happened. And it will be told in the low voices of soldiers on cold nights, for as long as there are storms to remember her by and silence for her to fill. She held them off long enough. She held them off forever. But before any of that could settle into legend, before Avery could even begin the long fight to get her hands back, there was one more reckoning waiting for her. And it was not a physical one. And in some ways, it was harder than the mountain had been. It came in the quiet of the hospital in the long empty hours when there was nothing to do but heal and think, and thinking for a soldier like Avery Collins was its own kind of enemy. Because when the doing stops, the remembering starts, and she began to remember in pieces the 4 days on the mountain in a way she had not let herself experience them while they were happening. On the mountain, there had been no time for feeling. There had only been the next handhold, the next breath, the next calculation. Feeling was a luxury, and she had spent it all on staying alive. But now safe and warm and whole enough to survive the feelings she had refused to feel came looking for her, and they did not come gently. She dreamed of the crack in the rock. She dreamed of her dead left hand refusing to grip. She dreamed over and over of the 6 seconds after she took the shot, that endless stretch of silence, while the bullet was in the air and everything hung in the balance. And in the dreams, the bullet never arrived. The commander never fell. The mortars fired, and she woke in the dark with her ruined hands clutching at a rifle that was not there, certain for one terrible disoriented moment. That she had missed, that she had failed, that 40 men had died because she wasn't good enough. It was Doyle of all people who helped her through it, and that surprised her because Doyle was the one who had called her odds the lowest. Doyle was the veteran who had gently told Brennan that the cold just takes you, it doesn't ask permission. But Doyle came to see her once made the long trip the way Brennan had, and he sat down beside her bed with his gray weathered face and his careful hands, and he did not offer her any comfortable words because Doyle did not deal in comfortable words. "You're not sleeping," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she admitted. She didn't bother to hide it from him. There was no point hiding anything from a man who had carried her down a mountain. "You dream about missing." She looked at him sharply. "How did you know that?" "Because I've been doing this a long time, Sergeant, and every good shooter I ever knew dreams about the shots they made, not the ones they missed, the misses you forget, the hits, the ones that mattered, the ones where lives hung on them. Those come back at night, and they make you doubt yourself in your sleep in a way you never doubted yourself when you were awake. It's the price of caring whether you hit." He leaned forward. "You want to know how I knew you dream about missing? Because you're the kind of soldier who cares. The kind who does the math to save people she can't even hear. Soldiers like that always pay for it later in the dark. It's not a flaw, it's the receipt." She sat with that for a long moment. "Does it stop?" "No," Doyle said honestly, But you learn to carry it, and you learn that the dream where you miss is just fear talking, and fear's a liar. You know what actually happened? You were there. You made the shot. 40 men are breathing because of it, and one of them is that boy Brennan, who won't shut up about you. And the fear can whisper all at once in the dark, but it can't change one single thing about what you actually did on that mountain. He stood to leave, then paused. You didn't miss, Collins. You'll never miss in the only way that counts. Let the dreams say whatever they want. You know the truth. And slowly, in the way that all real healing happens without any single dramatic moment, just the accumulation of days, the dreams loosened their grip, and she began to sleep, and she began to carry it the way Doyle had said she would, not by forgetting, but by knowing. Meanwhile, back at the outpost, the men who had lived through the mountain were doing their own carrying, each in his own way, and the platoon that came out of that valley was not the same platoon that had gone into it. Something had happened to them up there, something that went beyond the survival, something in the way they had every one of them been asked to throw out the math and reach for the impossible, and none of them ever fully went back to being who they'd been before. Webb, who had stood in Sullivan's doorway and gently insisted after 96 hours that nobody survives that long, out there became of all things the fiercest believer in the platoon. The first to argue against writing anyone off, the last to give up on a bad situation, and when men asked him why, he would only say that he had learned the hard way what happens when you count someone out too early. Ramirez, who had knelt over Avery on that ledge halfway down the draw and felt her heart nearly stop under his hands, carried the memory of that moment as a kind of fuel, and he became one of the finest combat medics anyone in that unit had ever seen, a man who refused to accept that anyone was too far gone because he had held a woman who should have been dead and felt her heart come back, and after that he simply would not believe in lost causes. And Brennan was changed most of all, and yet in a way he was changed least because the mountain had not made him into something new, so much as it had proven that the thing he already was had been right all along. He had believed she was alive when every veteran in that room had buried her. He had been the youngest and the greenest and the one they all quietly indulged, and he had turned out to be the only one who saw the truth. That does something to a young man. It does not make him arrogant, not if he's built right, and Brennan was built right. It makes him trust the thing inside himself that knows the quiet certainty that the wise older voices sometimes drown out. Brennan came off that mountain a soldier who trusted his own conviction, and it made him, in the years that followed, into exactly the kind of leader that Sullivan had become, a man who knew when to throw out the book. Sullivan watched all of it, watched his platoon transform in the aftermath, and he understood that Avery Collins had given them more than their lives. She had given them a story to become. Every unit needs one. Every group of people who have survived something together needs a truth at the center of them that tells them who they are. And the truth at the center of that platoon, from that day forward, was a wounded woman on a mountain who did not quit, and it made them all a little braver, a little more stubborn, a little less willing to accept the reasonable, comfortable surrender that the world is always offering. There was a moment near the very end of Avery's time at that hospital, before she moved on to the long grind of therapy in a place far away, when the whole story crystallized into a single conversation that all of them would remember. Sullivan came to say goodbye. He had traveled a long way to do it because the outpost was far and the roads were bad and a captain's time was not his own, but he came anyway, the way he did things now, choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. He sat beside her bed, and for a while neither of them spoke because they had never needed many words, the two of them. Then Sullivan said, "I keep thinking about the 4 days before the shot when we didn't know if you were alive." "I know you talked to me," Avery said quietly, "on the radio." Sullivan went still. "You couldn't have heard that. Your radio was dead. It's buried in the snow. You told the debriefers yourself." "It was," Avery said. "I didn't hear a word of it. Not one." She looked at him steadily. "But I knew you were doing it anyway. I knew up on that mountain that somewhere down in that outpost there was a captain who hadn't folded my flag in his head. I didn't need to hear it. I just needed to know it was true. And it was true, wasn't it?" Sullivan's throat worked. 4 days, he said. "I never stopped." "I know," she said. "That's why I took the shot. You want to know the truth, Captain. The real truth, not the legend they're all telling now. I didn't take that shot for 40 men. 40 men is too big. You can't feel 40 men. It's just a number, and numbers don't make you spend the last of your life on an impossible shot. She was quiet a moment. I took it because I knew there was somebody down there who hadn't given up on me, and I couldn't stand the idea of giving up on him. That's all it was. That's the whole thing. It was never about the range or the wind or the math. It was about not letting down the one person who refused to let me down. That's what got the trigger pulled. Not heroism, just that. And Captain Mark Sullivan, who had wept alone in an empty command room when he heard she was alive, sat beside her in him and understood that the greatest thing he had ever done in his entire career of command was the simplest and the least visible. The thing no report would ever record, the thing that had won a battle without him ever knowing it at the time. He had refused to give up on one soldier in the privacy of his own mind when giving up would have been reasonable. And that refusal had traveled up a mountain without a single working radio, carried on nothing but the invisible thread that binds soldiers to one another, and it had put a bullet through the heart of an enemy assault and saved every soul under his command. "You held the line for me," Avery said. "So I held the line for you. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. That's the only thing that's ever worked." "Yeah," Sullivan said, and his voice was rough. "Yeah, it is." She healed. She fought her way back. She lay behind a rifle again and hit what she aimed at and wept for joy in the doing of it. And she served on quiet and scarred and steady, and she became the legend the whispers made of her without ever once claiming it for herself. And through all the years that followed, whenever the doubt came at her in the dark, whenever the fear whispered its lie that she had missed, that she wasn't enough, she remembered what she had learned in the crack in the rock. The deepest truth the mountain had taught her, deeper even than the shot. You are never as alone as the silence makes you feel. The radio can be dead. The storm can be screaming. Every reasonable person in the world can have already counted you out and folded your flag and moved on to grieving. And still, somewhere out in that silence, there can be one person who has not let go of you. And that one person, that single-held thread of faith, can be enough to make the impossible possible, enough to put steel back in a dying hand, enough to send one bullet across an impossible distance to change everything. That was the truth of the mountain. That was the truth she carried to the end of her days. She was given up for dead, and she was not dead. She was written out of the record, and she was not forgotten. She was told she would never shoot again, and she shot again. Every single time the world told Avery Collins that a thing could not be done, she did it not because she was fearless, and not because she was more than human, but because she had learned the one lesson that outlasts all the others, the lesson that turns ordinary people into the kind that whole platoons survive on. Probably is not certainly. The silence is not empty, and a single soul who refuses to quit can hold back the whole weight of the storm. They gave up on her. She saved them anyway. And the shot from nowhere, fired by a woman nobody knew was still alive, echoed down through every year that followed, in the low voices of grateful men, in the steadied nerve of frightened soldiers on cold nights, in the unbroken chain of lives that hung once on a single held breath high on a frozen mountain. She held them off long enough. She held them off forever. And that is the truth that no storm will ever bury, and no report will ever erase, and no silence will ever swallow, for as long as there are soldiers left to remember what one person can do when everyone else has already given up.